Chapter 561. The knife in Shui Ilan's hand was clearly not a normal knife. It was cold and had a strange light, making his eyes seem like they were filled with a ghostly aura. His knife was already close to his chest, but he still had a smile on his face. Han Shangyue, if we're talking about ruthlessness, you can't compare to me. Can you bear to see her hurt? Can you bear to see her hurt? Han Shanyue's eyebrows jumped, but before he could open his mouth, Ning Shuima suddenly moved. She held the golden hairpin in her hand and pressed it against her chest. She raised her eyebrows and said, Shui Ilan, I won't go with you. I'd rather die if I go with you. As for the pain you speak of, pain really doesn't mean anything to me. As soon as she finished speaking, she raised the hairpin and stabbed it into her own arm. Her stab was not light, as it went into her flesh by 1 or 2 inches. Blood immediately flowed out. Ning Shuima, don't be stupid. Han Shanyue raised his hand and grabbed her wrist, preventing her from hurting herself again. Ning Shuima's face was pale from the pain, but she still smiled. I'm only doing this to tell you one thing. If you hand me over to him, I'd rather die. Her gaze fell on Shui Ilan, and her voice was cold. Shui Ilan, I'm not ruthless. Pain really doesn't mean anything to me. If you don't believe me, then try hurting yourself. This time it was Shui Ilan's turn to be speechless. His gaze fell on her arm that was still bleeding, and his pupils shrank. He suddenly sighed. All right, you win. The blue knife in his hand disappeared, and he calmly smiled at Han Shanyue. I choose the first option. But the reason I chose this is not because I'm afraid of you, but because I'm afraid of her. I'm afraid she'll kill herself. He looked at Ning Shuima and sighed. Little Shuima, I only wanted to keep you by my side. Do you hate me so much? Ning Shuima had long been immune to his affections, so she smiled back at him. Her smile was gentle, but her words were not gentle at all. I can't wait for you to die. Shui Ilan choked and looked at her gently. But I want you to live in this world for a long time. Ning Shuima. Was this bastard's face made of iron? It was unprecedentedly thick. Shui Ilan was also straightforward. Since he had chosen the first option, he didn't dawdle. He pointed at a certain part of his arm and flicked a blood-red bead towards Han Shanyue. Han Shanyue took it and looked at it. After confirming that it was indeed the antidote, he passed it to Ning Shuima. Ning Shuima didn't care about anything else and swallowed it. The heart-linking goo poison couldn't be seen from the pulse. Ning Shuima sensed her body, but she didn't feel anything. Shui Ilan glanced at her. Suddenly, he used his palm as a knife and cut his own arm. His arm was cut open and blood gushed out. Ning Shuima didn't expect him to do this and was secretly shocked. Her body tensed up and she subconsciously waited for the pain to come. But it didn't. She didn't feel anything. The heart-linking goo poison was really broken. Ning Shuima couldn't help but look at Shui Ilan again. That guy lost such a large piece of flesh on his arm, but he was still fine. When he saw her looking at him, he even smiled at her. Little Shuima, it's not that I can't beat you. It's just that I can't bear to part with you. He didn't look at Han Shanyue and the others anymore and turned around to leave. He was in a good mood and sang as he walked. The sun rises in the east, red clothes like fire. The spring flowers are bright. The night is waning. Holding the beauty in my arms, my heart is sad. The past is hard to recall. The zither is hard to reconcile. Chapter 562. His voice was actually very pleasant to listen to. It was deep and hoarse. His voice echoed on the main road and gradually faded away. Yunqi looked at his back and clenched her fists. Sir, this demon is very powerful. I'm afraid that it will become a problem in the future. Han Shanyue was also looking at Shui Ilan's back. His eyes flickered slightly. He vaguely felt that the tune of the song was familiar, but he couldn't remember where he had heard it before. An image seemed to flash in his mind. When he tried to grasp it, it was a blur. He acted as if he hadn't heard Yunqi's words. Yunqi's eyes flashed with hidden bitterness. She looked at Ning Shuima in his arms. Ning Shuima seemed to be in a daze. Shui Ilan's song made her heart tremble as if it had been scalded. The tune of the lyrics was so familiar that it made her heart palpitate. It was as if she had heard it many years ago, or even sung it. But when she thought about it carefully, she couldn't remember. It was like prenatal education music. When a child grew up and heard the music in his mother's womb, he would feel an inexplicable sense of familiarity and even a faint sense of sadness. Her hand unconsciously tugged at Han Shanyue's clothes, but the wound on her arm was healing at a speed visible to the naked eye. Yunqi's eyes fell on Han Shanyue's left hand. His left hand had been pressing on Ning Shuima's back, and he hadn't forgotten to heal her for a moment. No wonder this girl's wound healed so quickly. The scene in front of Yunqi was undoubtedly glaring to her eyes. Her eyes darkened, and then she slowly smiled. She took 2 steps forward and quietly held onto Han Shanyue's arm. "Sir, is this Miss Ning?" What happened to her face? Although Han Shanyue and Yunqi were friends, there weren't many opportunities for them to be physically close. Usually, before Yunqi could really get close to him, he would quietly retreat. He had a serious obsession with cleanliness. He didn't want to have physical contact with anyone, not even his friends. Even Rongyue Tianlan, who wasn't very reliable, didn't dare to touch him. Normally, Yunqi wouldn't dare do it. At most, she would pull on his sleeve occasionally. However, after he glanced at her, she didn't even dare to pull on his sleeve. However, after this meeting, her attitude towards him seemed to be different. She would intentionally or unintentionally get close to him. This time, she even had the guts of a leopard and directly held his arm. Han Shanyue subconsciously flicked his sleeve. Yunqi's arm went numb, and she couldn't help but let go. She also took 2 steps back. Her expression changed slightly. In fact, she had mustered up her courage to do this. She thought that since he was carrying Ning Shuima in his arms, he would allow others to get close to him. She didn't expect. She pursed her lips and couldn't help but look at Ning Shuima. However, she saw that her eyes were also looking at her. There seemed to be a light flickering in her eyes, as if she was proud of herself, but also as if she was mocking her. Yunqi's face turned pale. She felt as though she had been slapped silently. Hatred flashed through his usually merciful heart. Her fingers clenched in her sleeves. This woman was clearly an ordinary person. What right did an ant-like race have to compete with her? She could crush her to death with just a finger. After all, she was a person who had cultivated for thousands of years. Although her heart was in turmoil, she didn't show it on the surface. In fact, she had wronged Ning Shuima. Ning Shuima's eyes had only unconsciously landed on her. In fact, she was still in a daze. Chapter 563. Ning Shuima was trying her best to figure out the origin of the song. How could she be in the mood to mock Yunqi? Shui Ilan had already walked far away, leaving only a small black dot behind. Her gaze was still fixed in that direction, somewhat absent-minded. Han Shanyue looked down and noticed her expression. His eyes darkened slightly, and he quietly turned her in another direction. Ning Shuima, do you want to maintain this appearance? Or revert to your original appearance? He asked coldly. This sentence immediately pulled Ning Shuima's thoughts back to reality. Maintain this appearance? It would be better to just kill her. She immediately hugged one of his arms. Master Han, you have a way, right? Han Shanyue's lips curled up slightly. He was secretly satisfied with her actions, but his face remained cold. I do have a way, but the price is not small. What price? Ning Shuima blinked and looked at him with a slight smile. With Master Han's abilities, you shouldn't care about any price, right? I'm very calculative, and I never do things that are useless. I don't do things that lose money. Han Shanyue's voice was still cold and indifferent. Ning Shuima secretly gritted her teeth. Was this bastard trying to take advantage of her? She raised her arm and looked at it. It seemed to be wrapped in a layer of old person's real skin. She also knew simple disguise techniques. She should be able to remove these things herself, right? She didn't want to be threatened by him. She opened her mouth to speak, but a blue shadow flashed in the distance. Kirin was running over as fast as it could. Master, I can sense Master's aura, it shouted as it ran. When it suddenly saw this scene, it was stunned. Then, it suddenly came over and sniffed Ning Shuima's aura. Moss. Master? Little apple. Ning Shuima reached out and touched the horn on its head. Kieran's body stiffened, and it looked as if it had been struck by lightning. Master, we haven't seen each other for a day. How did you become so old? Ning Xuema was speechless. Don't spout nonsense. Your master was disguised by that pervert Shui Elon. I won't grow old. She was still a delicate flower, a budding age. How could she grow old overnight? But master, your voice is so old. She sounded no different from a real old lady. I was probably forced to take some medicine. I'll do some research on it later. I'll recover. Ning Xuema was full of confidence. She also knew how to make voice-changing drugs, so naturally, she knew how to neutralize it as well. The little Qilin was finally relieved. Are you sure you can handle it? Han Shangyue, who had been ignored, asked. He should be able to, right? She only needed to remove the scab on her body and take some medicine to restore her voice. Ning Xuema nodded. Han Shangyue looked at her with a faint smile and said, I'll wait and see. Then he turned around and left with her in his arms. Sir, what about these girls? Yunqi asked from the side, pointing at the 3 girls who were still sitting in the carriage. Han Shangyue seemed to have just noticed the 3 girls. He glanced at them and said indifferently, Yunqi, I'll leave them to you. Then, he strode away. Yunqi's expression changed slightly. These 3 girls were under Shui Ilan's hypnotic spell. Yunqi did have a way to neutralize it, but it would take some time. Her body suddenly swayed and leaned against the snow lion. She let out a low moan. Her voice was neither loud nor soft, so Han Shangyue, who had just walked a few feet away, could hear it. Chapter 564. Han Shangyue turned around, and his gaze fell on Yunqi. Her face was slightly pale, and there was cold sweat on her forehead. She seemed very weak. There weren't many people that Han Shangyue treated as friends, and Yunqi was one of them. It was rare to see her so weak, so he was naturally concerned and looked over. Seeing that she had finally attracted his attention, Yunqi pursed her lips slightly and straightened her body. She said apologetically, I'm fine. It's just that I was a little out of breath when I was cultivating yesterday. I was also a little tired last night. I'll be fine after some rest. I'll dispel the bewitching spell for them later. Her words were very considerate. Han Shangyue didn't say anything. He placed Ning Xuema on Kieran's back and let her sit sideways. He instructed her, be good and wait here. He walked back and reached out to feel Yunqi's pulse. Her pulse was indeed a little weak and messy. It was a sign that her breath had diverged. Yunqi looked at his lowered eyebrows and her heart thumped wildly. After knowing him for so long, she had very few chances to have physical contact with him. She had achieved success in her cultivation and had 2 great gods as her friends. There was almost no chance of her getting hurt or sick. Occasionally, when she got sick or injured, Rongyue Tianlan could easily treat her. She didn't even have the chance to pretend to be weak. Perhaps the threesome was indeed a mistake. If she wanted to pursue him, she had to seize all kinds of opportunities to be alone. For example, yesterday, because she was a little upset, her breath had diverged while she was cultivating. She had almost gone mad. Before she could recover, she had been caught by Han Shangyue. After running around with him for half the night, her body was indeed a little weak. His fingers rested on her wrist. It was slightly cold. Her heart was burning with passion. She lowered her eyes slightly and didn't dare to show any emotion. However, her slightly red cheeks betrayed her excitement at the moment. Calm down and get rid of all distracting thoughts, Han Shangyue said in a calm voice. Yunqi's heart skipped a beat. She knew that he was going to use his telekinesis to heal her body. It was a rare opportunity for him to heal her, so Yunqi naturally didn't want to let it go. She nodded obediently. Okay. After saying that, she was still worried. Sir, you've been running around all night. Can your body still take it? Let Yunqi recuperate on her own. Yunqi doesn't want you to use too much telekinesis. It's all right. Han Shangyue only said 2 words. He raised his hand, and a futon appeared on the ground. Sit and meditate. Yunqi's heart warmed as she smiled. Her smile was like a beautiful flower blooming gently. Then Yunqi will accept your offer. Sure enough, she sat down on the praying mat. While she was adjusting her breath, she quietly glanced at Ning Xuema, who was not far away. Ning Shuima, who was sitting on Kieran's back, saw everything, but she didn't care. She was chatting with Kieran in a low voice. Although they had only been separated for one night, Kieran felt as if they had been separated for a year. She had a lot to say. Without waiting for Ning Shuima to ask, it spilled the beans from a bamboo tube and told her everything that happened that night. Kieran loved to gossip. Moreover, Yunshi had intentionally or unintentionally talked about her relationship with Han Shanyue in front of her. It seemed like they were very, very good friends who had accompanied each other for countless years. At this time, Kieran's words were implied. Ning Shuima listened and nodded slightly. She glanced at Han Shanyue. So this person also had friends. Chapter 565. She thought that Han Shanyue was so powerful that he didn't have any friends. No wonder there was a saying that Qin Hui had 3 childhood friends. It seemed that this saying was true. She saw that Han Shanyue was about to sit on Yunshi's back and heal her. She didn't know how long this delay would take, so she might as well bring Kieran into the city first and find an inn to get rid of the old lady's skin. She was also someone who loved cleanliness. Now that there was an additional layer of old lady's skin on her body, she felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't wait to clean herself up and take a bath. She took advantage of the fact that Han Shanyue had just sat down and had yet to circulate his energy. She rode Kieran over and said, "Master Han, you go ahead. Little Apple and I will find an inn in the city to wash up." She felt that since Han Shanyue had just saved her, it was only right for her to inform him before leaving. However, just as she spoke, Han Shanyue waved his sleeves at her and said, "Be good and stay here. Don't be nosy." A faint white light enveloped Ning Shuima, and her body became weak again. Ning Shuima was speechless. Wasn't this person too unreasonable? He wanted to heal his friend, so why did he have to drag her along to watch? Forget it. Since he had saved her from the fire pit, she wouldn't argue with him over such trivial matters. Since he wanted her to watch, then she would just watch. It was a good opportunity to learn another skill. In this perverted continent, having one more skill would increase one's chances of success. She sat lazily on Kieran's back, and her eyes fell on the two of them. She wanted to learn. Han Shanyue raised his head and glanced at her. He didn't know why, but his heart was faintly unhappy. However, it was rare for her to be so obedient, so he couldn't say anything wrong with her. He didn't know what was going on with him recently, but his usually calm mind was somewhat unstable. Especially when it came to matters related to her, his mood became even more unstable. "You want to learn how to heal people?" Ning Shuima nodded and admitted honestly, "I want to learn." He had healed people on the road, so this skill shouldn't be a secret, right? "You think you can learn just by sitting there?" Han Shanyue raised his eyebrows. When he was treating someone, his palm would be pressed on the person's back without moving. He relied entirely on his psychokinesis to circulate in the injured person's body. He knew where he should circulate his psychokinesis first, where he should not circulate it, and where he should not circulate it. These were all very important, but they could not be understood from the outside. The onlookers could not see where his psychokinesis was flowing to at all. She was learning from so far away? Not a chance at all. In fact, Ning Shuima also somewhat understood this principle. She knew that even if she looked carefully, she might not be able to see through it. However, it was a little boring to sit here. She also had the thought that she could understand as much as she could. Hence, when she heard Han Shanyue's question, she answered honestly, "Whatever I can learn is good. You know, I'm very smart." Han Shanyue was speechless. She was really narcissistic. However, what she said was true. She was indeed very smart. "Come here," he said directly, and with a wave of his sleeve, he released her from her restraints. "What are you doing?" Ning Shuima was puzzled. Wasn't he treating his friend? Did he need someone to help him with this kind of treatment? However, looking at Han Shanyue's expression, if she didn't go over, he probably wouldn't give up. Since he was her savior, she would listen to him this time. Chapter 566. When necessary, Ning Shuima was very obedient. She walked over. As she walked, she realized that there were several holes in her skirt and pants, and a cool breeze was blowing in. Needless to say, She had worn them out when she had been desperately trying to rush the carriage. She hadn't had time to check them. She felt that something was wrong, so she looked down and heaved a sigh of relief. The holes were around her knees and the bottom of her pants. Apart from slightly affecting her appearance, there was no danger of her being exposed. Furthermore, she looked like an old woman with one foot in the grave, so there was nothing to be exposed about. She walked over to Han Shangyue. "Master Han, what instructions do you have for me?" Han Shangyue conjured another praying mat. "Sit." Ning Shuima didn't know what he was up to. She looked at Yunqi and then at Han Shangyue in confusion. Yunqi was also confused. She turned to look at Han Shangyue and asked, "Sir, what is this?" Han Shangyue didn't seem to be bothered to explain, so he only said, "Sit properly and regulate your breathing." Yunqi didn't dare disobey him, so she sat up straight and tried her best to regulate her breathing. Han Shangyue sat behind her. Yunqi only felt joy and peace, but with the addition of the senile Ning Shuima, she felt somewhat uncomfortable and almost couldn't concentrate. Han Shangyue clearly sensed her unstable state of mind, so he said faintly, "3 flowers at one's prominence, 5 hearts at one's origin." As he recited a string of incantations, his palm pressed against her back. Psychokinesis slowly flowed in, forcibly helping her to calm down. Yunqi's heart warmed. She closed her eyes and abandoned all distracting thoughts. She sensed his psychokinesis and let her own psychokinesis merge with his before following him. His psychokinesis was vigorous and boundless. After the yang qi entered her body, wherever it passed, the muscles and meridians that had been slightly damaged due to qi deviation finally began to slowly recover. This time, Han Shangyue was especially talkative. Every time he helped Yunqi circulate her meridians, he would calmly explain the principle and the next step to take. Ning Shuima sat beside him and listened to his explanation. She benefited greatly. This great god's treatment was different from that of an ordinary doctor. It was completely different from what she had learned in the past. However, there was also the wonder of achieving the same goal through different means. She looked at the light emitted from his palm. It was no longer the usual white light, but a faint green light. Needless to say, he was using the wood element of telekinesis. He was indeed a god. Other people only had 1 or 2 types of psychokinesis, and even if they cultivated for a lifetime, they might not reach the peak. He, on the other hand, had cultivated all 5 elements. Moreover, he was very familiar with each element and could use them as he pleased. No matter how smart a genius was, it was impossible for him to reach this level. Unless he lived long enough and had an endless amount of time, he would have plenty of time to cultivate these things, this person. I'm afraid he's far older than 70 or 80, right? 1,000 years old? Long live? Tens of thousands of years old? She was slightly distracted. Suddenly, his hand tightened around her wrist. Distracted? Ning Shuima suddenly regained her senses and couldn't help but glance at Han Shangyue. This guy was treating someone's injuries. Shouldn't he be concentrating at this time? He was actually able to sense her momentary distraction. This was too abnormal. She coughed and wanted to withdraw her hand. No, you can continue. Han Shangyue glanced at her. He had no intention of letting go of her wrist. Instead, he pulled her small hand over and pressed it on Yunqi's back. You have to sense the flow of this psychokinesis yourself. You can't be distracted again. Chapter 567. Ning Shuima was speechless. Almighty, this isn't good, is it? Isn't this using Miss Yunqi as a living teaching material? Before she could say anything, Han Shanyue's palm was already superimposed on the back of her hand. His telekinesis was first transmitted to her palm, then from her palm to Yunqi's body. This was an extremely novel experience. Furthermore, this kind of experience wasn't available all the time. Although Ning Shuima vaguely felt that it wasn't very kind to treat Yunqi this way, she couldn't resist now, so she might as well learn seriously. In any case, when she had studied medicine in her previous life, she had done countless internships with men and women from all walks of life. Now that she had a fairy sister, it was a very rare experience. This kind of teaching method was extremely effective. Ning Shuima could almost feel the frequency and speed of the telekinesis flow. She could also sense the subtle reactions of the other party's meridians when the telekinesis washed over them. She had first-hand information. Fortunately, Yunqi had already entered a meditative state and had entered a state of complete selflessness. She didn't even realize that she was being taught medicine as a living teaching material. Otherwise, she would have been so angry that she would have vomited blood. Yunqi's injuries weren't considered serious. Han Shangyue helped her recuperate 3 times with his telekinesis before her damaged meridians were finally restored to their original state. Now that Yunqi had recovered, Ning Xuema had benefited greatly. Her medical skills had improved imperceptibly. After the recuperation, Han Shangyue finally stopped and removed his hands from Yunqi's back. Ning Xuema naturally removed her hands without batting an eyelid. She was about to walk away without batting an eyelid when Yunqi opened her eyes. She sensed her body and realized that all the soreness caused by the crossroads had disappeared without a trace. She had completely recovered. She glanced back at Han Shangyue and smiled. "Thank you, sir." Her eyes were full of smiles. After saying this, she glanced at Ning Xuema with a trace of delight in her eyes. She couldn't hide it. Ning Xuema smiled back at her. Her smile was very gentle. She looked like an old woman now, but her smile made her look very amiable, like an old granny. Yunqi felt that her smile was a little strange, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Ning Xuema gave her a comforting smile and was about to slip away when Han Shangyue grabbed her wrist again. "How much of what I just taught you do you remember?" Why did he have to rub salt into her wound? "Big brother, you'll hurt the beauty's heart." Ning Xuema chuckled and said vaguely, "I remember everything. Thank you for your guidance." "Then tell me, which are the important acupoints? What percentage of psychokinesis do I have to use?" Han Shangyue obviously did not want to let her off. Like a strict teacher, he wanted his student to answer his questions. Yunqi seemed to have heard something, and her pretty face turned pale again. She looked at one person and then another, and a bad feeling arose in her heart. Ning Xuema was defeated by Han Shangyue. This person's ability is definitely heaven-defying, but his EQ seems to be heaven-defying as well. She wanted to withdraw her hand, but she was not as strong as him. With this tug, she stumbled and almost fell into his arms. "Why are you hiding? You can't answer?" Han Shanyue's face darkened. Ning Xuema felt a little sad. Was Han Shanyue treating her as a concubine or a disciple? Forget it, it seemed that it would not be right if she did not answer today. Chapter 568. Forget it, it seemed like she couldn't keep quiet today. Anyway, it was his friend's heart that was hurt, not hers. If he didn't appreciate her occasional kindness, then she would say it. "Of course, I remember. Using 30% of your strength from the back?" She began to explain the pressure points he had used to guide her. Her memory was excellent, so she was able to recite them exactly. Han Shanyue's expression finally eased. Although he didn't say anything, he still looked satisfied. His expression eased, but Yunqi's pretty face turned pale. She was quite proficient in this area of medicine, so she knew that the process Ning Xuema had described couldn't be understood just by watching. It had to be done personally. He actually let this woman do it on her. He was using her as a living teaching material. This was simply a slap to her face. No matter how restrained Yunqi was and how she didn't dare to provoke Han Shanyue, she was furious. I worked so hard for you. And you actually humiliated me like this?" She was so angry that her lips trembled and she couldn't speak clearly. Han Shanyue slowly stood up, his voice still indifferent. "Yunqi, you worked hard for me all night. Do you feel wronged?" Yunqi was stunned. Yunqi didn't mean that. "Do you think that I should be deeply grateful to you just because you've helped me this time?" "No, absolutely not." Yunqi shook her head. In the thousands of years that they had known each other, Dizwa had done many things for her. He had saved her many times, but she had done very little for him. She didn't know how many favors she owed Dizwa over the years, but she felt that it was natural for a woman to owe a man a favor. She had accepted it as a matter of course and had never thought of how to repay it. Dizwa was too powerful, so he had never asked her to repay the favor. This time, Dizwa had asked her to help him find someone. She felt that she had finally helped Diesel once, so he should treat her better and remember her favor. Of course, this was just her subconscious thought. She hadn't actually thought about it that much. Then what are you angry about? I was just taking advantage of the situation and teaching her some medical knowledge. How is that an insult to you? Yunqi's pretty face turned green and white. She didn't know how to answer his question. After a moment, she choked out, Yunqi? Yunqi just doesn't want to be a living example, huh? Han Shangyue raised his eyebrows. When Tianlan taught you medical skills, she didn't let you practice with any patience. Of course there is. It was almost impossible to learn good medical skills without having patience. Does his patient feel insulted? Yunqi was speechless. When Rongyue Tianlan taught her medical skills, she also let her operate on the spot. Those patients were all in fear and trepidation, feeling very honored. They are just ordinary warriors, Yunqi finally struggled to say. A patient is a patient. There is no difference in status. Han Shanyue's voice was still as calm as flowing water. Yunqi, if you feel that I owe you a favor for working for me this time, I will return the favor in the future. From then on, we will never cross paths again. Yunqi immediately panicked. This was not the result she wanted. She couldn't care less and stepped forward. Sir, Yunqi definitely didn't mean that. Chapter 569. She couldn't care less as she stepped forward. Sir, I definitely didn't mean that. I've always treated you as my best friend. What's the point of owing favors between friends? If you think about it seriously, I owe you a lot. If you continue to say this, I'll be too ashamed to show my face. I said something wrong just now. I apologize to you. She gathered her sleeves and bowed to Han Shanyue. How could this be? Ning Xuema felt that her horizons had been broadened. Han Shanyue was clearly in the wrong, yet he could make him bow to him with just a few words. Although this guy's EQ was negative, he wasn't bad at all. Ning Xuema's gaze once again shifted to Yunqi's body. She saw that her eyes were brimming with tears, making her look pitiful. She was born extremely beautiful, and a man's heart of stone was best touched by a beauty's tears. Normally, when a man saw her like this, even if he was furious, he would just let it go. He would even comfort the beauty a few times. However, Han Shanyue was obviously not an ordinary man. He was like an iceberg that couldn't be warmed. Yunqi had already lowered herself to such a low level, yet all she got in return was a grunt from him before he ignored her. Instead, he picked up Ning Xuema, who was watching calmly from the sidelines. Ning Xuema wasn't worried that he would carry her. She was stunned. I can walk by myself? When Han Shanyue had grabbed her hand to treat Yunqi's injury, his telekinesis had passed through her palm and unavoidably adjusted her blood vessels. She didn't feel any discomfort now. She could even do a round of boxing with no problem, let alone walk. Just as she was about to struggle, Han Shanyue's arms tightened slightly. Be good. The wide sleeves covered the torn part of her trousers, intentionally or unintentionally. Sir, where are we going? Yunqi, who was behind him, had already sorted out her dispirited mood and was reinvigorated. Your injury has just healed. Go back and recuperate, Han Shanyue instructed without turning his head. Yunqi was stunned as she watched his back disappear into the distance. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. Shamelessly following her would make her lose face. She was unwilling to give up just like that. He stood in the same spot for a moment. Then, he seemed to have thought of something and let out a sigh of relief. He looked at the three women in the carriage. A moment later, she undid the bewitching spell on the three women. Where are you taking me? Ning Xuema was also puzzled. He seemed to be addicted to hugging her and was still hugging her at this time. Didn't you want to get rid of the disguise yourself? Weren't they looking for an inn? Han Shanyue asked. All right, so he was carrying her to the inn. At this moment, the sun had already risen high up in the sky. Pedestrians began to appear one after another on this road. Some were riding horses, some were sitting in sedan chairs, and some were walking. When these people saw Han Shanyue and his group, they all stopped to take a look. It couldn't be helped. This combination looked too strange. An otherworldly man was hugging an old lady in tattered clothes with a face full of wrinkles. Beside them was a majestic little Qilin. Along the way, Han Shangyue had received a lot of attention. He was already used to such gazes and acted as if nothing had happened. He seemed to be strolling leisurely, looking very lazy and leisurely. Ning Xuema, who was in his arms, suddenly burst out laughing. Han Shangyue looked at her strangely. "What are you laughing at?" He wasn't teasing her. Chapter 570. Hearing his question, Ning Xuema's eyes curved even more. She did not seem to have the intention to explain, but she could not help but laugh again. "So ugly." Han Shangyue did not hold back. "There are more wrinkles on your face when you laugh." All right, this guy was a sharp-tongued tsundere. When he insulted people, it was enough to make them suffer. Ning Xuema did not mind. Anyway, the wrinkles on her face were not her original appearance. So what if it was ugly? He usually had a cold aura, but his body was actually not cold. Ning Xuema felt very comfortable being hugged by him. There was an indescribable light fragrance on his body. If one did not smell it carefully, one would not be able to tell. However, it was refreshing and calming. Ning Xuema snuggled in his arms and felt a little sleepy. She felt as if she had slept in this embrace before. "Why were you laughing just now?" Han Shangyue obviously did not want to let her go. "I was laughing." Ning Xuema looked up at his face and said leisurely, "I was thinking that if you hugged me like this, in the eyes of outsiders, they would probably think that you were hugging your mother and praise you for being a filial son." Han Shangyue was speechless. He almost threw her out. "Old mother?" He had a faint smile on his face, and his tone was cold. Ning Xuema lifted her arms and hugged his neck, appeasing him. "I'm only saying that in the eyes of outsiders who don't know the truth. It's not like I'm really your mother. You're the one who asked me, so I told you my true thoughts. You can't be so petty and get angry just because of this, right?" This posture was supposed to be the posture of a blooming orchid, but Han Shangyue looked at her wrinkled face and did not feel anything good about it. He pulled her arms away from his neck and looked at her with a faint smile. "Are you acting coquettishly in front of me?" Ning Xuema was stunned. Before she could say anything, he continued. "An old woman acting coquettishly in front of a young man. Do you know how scary your image is?" Ning Xuema was speechless. She seemed to have been hit by his words and subconsciously defended herself. "I am not an old woman. I'm only 13. You're not a young man. You just look a little younger, but you're actually much older than me. I'm afraid you're more than old enough to be my grandfather." Why was this girl so concerned about his age? However, with his age, he was more than old enough to be her ancestor, let alone her grandfather. He was a little lost in thought, but he didn't argue with her. He just said, "Then you can call me Grandpa from now on." He absolutely could not accept this. Ning Xuema laughed. "Although you are old enough to be my grandfather, calling you Grandpa makes you sound old. It doesn't fit your image. I'll just call you Guru." Ning Xuema finally thought of the most suitable title. This title couldn't be more appropriate for him. God? Han Shanyue's eyes flickered, and his tone was somewhat unpredictable. "You know?" He changed his words. "Don't you always like to call me Great Master? Why did you change it to Guru?" Did she know something? Ning Xuema didn't notice the slight change in his tone. When she heard his question, she casually said, "Guru is a title for those who are super powerful, super strong, have a high status, and have a high status. It's most suitable for you." So that's what Guru meant. She really had a lot of strange words. Han Shanyue's tone was faint. "As you wish. Guru, how did you know that there was something wrong with the carriage?" Chapter 571. Great Master, how did you know that there was something wrong with the carriage? She thought that he didn't notice it at all and just passed by it. This carriage passed by me before. There were originally 8 people in the carriage and 1 coachman outside. Now that the coachman is gone, the 8 people in the carriage have become 5. Han Shanyue said slowly. Ning Xuema stared at him with her eyes wide open. At that time, the carriage had just passed by him, but he remembered so many things. He was indeed a great master. And then? Just based on this, he could tell that she was in the carriage. There were several wounds on the horse's buttocks from sharp objects. If the horse was really frightened, the coachman would pull the reins hard and not use sharp objects to provoke it. Therefore, it wasn't the horse that was frightened, but someone who was driving the horse to run faster. Ning Shuima stared at him without blinking. This guy really had a strong reasoning ability. If the horse was frightened and ran wildly, the people in the carriage would be very nervous and their heartbeats would increase. Especially the normal women, their heartbeats would be even more rapid. However, 3 of the women were breathing calmly and their heartbeats were even slower than usual. This proves that the 3 of them were controlled by someone. And the only man in the carriage had a rapid heartbeat, which proved that he had just run wildly. His heartbeat was rapid and strong, and his breathing was long, which proved that he was a highly skilled martial artist. If he was in the carriage just now, the horse wouldn't have been frightened and would have been controlled by him in an instant. He wouldn't have allowed a woman to drive the carriage while lying on her stomach. This is enough to prove that he was the one who chased after the carriage. The carriage didn't lose control, but it was driven away by someone, and the person who was escaping was that man. Ning Shuima was speechless. She had nothing to say. There aren't many people who can escape from such a person, and you are one of them. If I'm not wrong, you must have thought of a way to trick him off the carriage, and then you took him by surprise and escaped with the carriage. Is that so? He said it as if he had seen it with his own eyes. Ning Shuima gave him a thumbs up. Guru, even if you don't want to be a guru, you can still be a detective. Han Shanyue's eyes flashed with a hint of a smile, then he slowly opened his mouth. This carriage was originally going out of the city. You clearly knew that with his martial arts, he could easily catch up to you, but you still chose to run wildly. It should be because you saw your savior. At that time, when I passed by you, although I did not notice you, you saw me, right? The person you should be asking for help should be me. Am I right? He had seen through it all. Ning Shuima sighed. Shuima has nothing to say. The Almighty had guessed correctly. Since you've already seen through this, why did you wait for a moment before suddenly attacking? She thought she was completely ignored by him. Is there a need to doubt? If I were to act rashly while he was in the carriage, he would definitely use you as a hostage. Naturally, we have to wait for him to come out and attack him when he is unprepared. The Almighty's strategy was indeed well executed. Ning Shuima was completely convinced by this point. Although you ran away from me, you still trust me in your bones. Isn't that right? Han Shanyue's words suddenly came from the sky. Ning Shuima was speechless. She had forgotten about this. Because of his words, the harmonious atmosphere between the two of them became a little awkward. Ning Shuima couldn't help but ask, why me? Chapter 572. I've already answered this question before. There's no need to repeat it now, Han Shanyue said faintly. However, his answer back then was obviously perfunctory. She didn't believe that he was destined to be a loner. He had said that he only needed a concubine. Given the Almighty's abilities, he probably didn't choose a concubine just to satisfy his lust. Could it be that he was actually missing a shield? A shield to shield him from women? The more Ning Shuima thought about it, the more she felt that her deduction was reasonable. She could already see the relationship between this Almighty and Yunshi. It was a classic scene of falling flowers falling in love with the heartless brook. Yunshi liked this Almighty, but the Almighty only treated her as a friend. However, Yunshi didn't give up and finally started to pursue him. This annoyed the Almighty, but he didn't want to fall out with her. Therefore, he chose a concubine by his side to make her give up. Then, whether he hugged her or deliberately used Yunshi as a living example, could it be that it was all to make Yunshi angry? That was possible. After all, this Almighty didn't usually like to get close to people. Back then, she had only kissed him as a joke, but he had slapped her on the street. Later, he had suddenly changed and mysteriously appeared at the royal banquet. He had even hugged her and played the pipa, forcing her to marry him. That was probably the reason. She had offended him before, so he didn't feel guilty about using her as a shield. Plus, he knew that she didn't like him. Even if he dumped her in the future, she wouldn't pester him. Plus, she was just an ordinary person. Even if she wanted to pester him, she would probably be tortured to death by him at any time. She wouldn't cause him any trouble. Ning Shuima glanced back through the gap between Han Shanyue's arms. Yunqi was still standing there in the distance. Her figure looked a little bleak. She had obviously suffered a blow for some reason. Ning Shuima suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. She smiled and asked casually, "Almighty, you don't actually want a concubine, but a shield, right?" Huh. Han Shanyue raised his eyebrows. He didn't seem to understand where her deduction came from. "You don't love me, do you?" Ning Shuima asked again. Han Shanyue paused and looked down at her. After a while, he replied, "I will not love anyone, right?" She guessed that was it. "Then your excellency chose me to be your concubine because you wanted me to be your shield, right?" Ning Shuima finally asked the question that had been hovering in her mind. When she asked this question, she couldn't help but hold her breath. Han Shanyue was taken aback for a moment, then said lightly, "Is that what you think?" "That's right. Otherwise, I really can't figure out why you're forcing me to marry you. You clearly know that I don't love you." Ning Shuima blurted out the last sentence. After she finished speaking, her heart skipped a beat. Han Shanyue's footsteps paused again. His aura seemed to have cooled down. He said indifferently, "If that's the case, then you've guessed correctly. I will only treat you as a shield. You must remember this." Everything seemed to make sense now. Him marrying her as a concubine had nothing to do with love. Ning Shuima seemed to heave a sigh of relief. She looked at him and said, "I can be your shield, but I have a condition." Since everything was out in the open, she would first be a villain and then a gentleman. She would state all her conditions to maximize her benefits. Chapter 573. Han Shanyue glanced at her again. "Say it." Ning Shuima looked at his expressionless face and thought for a while. She organized her words and simply stated her condition. "I can be your concubine in name and be responsible for dealing with all kinds of women for you. But you and I don't have to consummate our marriage. We don't have to sleep together. What do you think?" Han Shanyue was speechless. "Did I say that I would consummate our marriage after marrying you?" His voice was cold and indifferent. It turned out that he didn't intend to consummate their marriage. That was great. Ning Shuima let out a sigh of relief and smiled. "Great God, are you saying that you agree to my conditions?" Han Shanyue looked at her smiling face and didn't know why he felt that it was particularly irritating. "I won't consummate my marriage with a shield." He glanced at her again. "Even if you want to, I won't allow it." Ning Shuima sighed in relief again. "It's great that you can think this way." If she knew that he would think this way, she wouldn't have run away. He used her as a shield and she could become stronger under his wings. When she had a certain level of strength, she would be able to make her own way. The sea is wide and the sky is high and the birds can fly. I can beat up whoever I don't like. I can make the whole world bow down to me. Ha ha ha. Instead of being chased by all kinds of people like a rat running across the street, constantly walking on the edge of danger, and almost having sex with the king of hell a few times. "Oh right, I'll be your shield concubine. Although I'm still pure, outsiders don't know. If you don't need me in the future, I'm afraid it'll be difficult for me to marry again. My future is bleak." She still wanted to marry someone else? Han Shanyue raised his eyebrows and looked at her. "So?" He seemed to be suppressing something and his voice was a little dull. "So you have to compensate me." Ning Shuima answered matter-of-factly. "What compensation do you want? Find a good husband for you in the future?" This was the first time someone bargained with him like this, and this girl was always the exception. Han Shanyue's voice was a little cold. "That won't be necessary. There's no need for you to worry about my marriage. Great God, you see, I'm the heavenly lone star that you personally conferred upon me. I'm like a rat that everyone wants to beat up. If I don't have good martial arts, I'll only be beaten up. It's very unpleasant. Why don't Great God teach me some martial arts during this period of time? Or give me some elixirs that can quickly improve my skills so that I can have enough ability to protect myself. You want to be my disciple?" Han Shanyue interrupted her and went straight to the point. Ning Shuima explained, "That's not necessary. Guru, you taught me kung fu as a condition for me to be your shield concubine. There's no master-disciple relationship between us. Terms of exchange, Han Shangyue lightly repeated. Then have you ever thought of becoming my disciple? I have imparted more martial arts to you. Not only do you have the ability to protect yourself, with the reputation of my disciple, no one on this continent would dare to bully you. Ning Shuima shook her head. I won't acknowledge you as my master. Why? He had always been the one to pick his disciples, and no disciple had ever dared to despise him. This was simply, for the first time, Han Shangyue had the urge to laugh. Ning Shuima covered her mouth and yawned. Master-disciple love is the most annoying thing. Han Shangyue. He didn't know what to think, but his voice was cold. I also hate it. What's the relationship between acknowledging a master and master-disciple love? Don't tell me you want. Ning Shuima interrupted him. Great God, you're thinking too much. I don't want to develop a relationship with you. Then why are you afraid of master-disciple love? Han Shanyue's voice was obviously unhappy. Great God, have you forgotten? I'm still your concubine. If I acknowledge you as my master, wouldn't I be both your disciple and your concubine? In the eyes of outsiders, we're a perverted master-disciple love. Han Shanyue secretly took a breath. So you also have times when you care about other people's opinions. Of course, when it's time to care, I still have to care. Great God, you'll agree to my terms, right? You see, you're only teaching me a part of your martial arts. There's no need for us to be master and disciple. Once the game is over, we can happily part ways. We don't owe each other anything. Game, once they part ways, they don't owe each other anything. Han Shanyue looked at her coldly. If this is what you want, I'll agree to it. Ning Shuima's eyes lit up. The negotiation was a success. She smiled. Then I'll thank you, great God. She began to draw a blueprint for a beautiful future in her heart. She was proud of herself. Her eyebrows became lively, and her pair of old eyes shone brightly. Just as she was fantasizing nonstop, her body suddenly soared into the sky like she was riding on a cloud. When she came back to her senses, she was already sitting on the little Qian's back. He threw her a little too hard. When Ning Shuima landed on Kiran's back, her but hurt a little. She hissed and looked at Han Shanyue in surprise. You. Han Shanyue's voice was cold. If you want to dream, go on Kiran's back. Don't drool in my arms. Drool? Did she? Ning Shuima couldn't help but touch the corner of her mouth. Of course, she didn't feel anything. Forget it. For the sake of a beautiful future, she wouldn't argue with him. She sat on Kiran's back and suddenly found a terrible problem. The crotch of her pants was torn. When she spread her legs, she could feel the cold wind. This posture was really unsightly. Ning Shuima immediately crossed her other leg over and sat diagonally on the Qian's back. Because she now had a plan for her future, she felt happy and straightforwardly sang, "Follow my left hand. Follow my right hand in slow motion. This song gives you happiness. Have you fallen in love with me? Follow my nose, move your eyes and ears, act good and handsome. Change your style. Youth is too much unknown guesses. Growing pains are nothing." She forgot that she had the hoarse voice of an old woman. Her singing was like a broken gong, and she was shocked when she sang. Her howl also attracted the attention of passers-by. They didn't understand why this old woman was so happy. Ning Shuima was not someone who cared about other people's opinions. Since she wanted to sing thoroughly. As long as she was happy, she didn't care about other people's opinions. So she was still singing happily. Her two little feet swung on Kiran's back. She looked very relaxed. My bravery is charged, reaching every place with my head held high, the sun of this world, because confidence can illuminate meth center of the stage. Only with me can I shine, only with me can I shine. Compared to Ning Shuima's good mood, Han Shanyue was still like a 1,000-year-old iceberg. She couldn't tell what he was feeling, but the air around him seemed to be colder. Ning Shuima's good mood lasted until they reached the inn, but after 2 hours, her mood couldn't be good anymore. Fuck. Tencent has gone crazy and directly transmigrated my chapter. I had to change it again. My heart is stifled. Chapter 574. After she entered the inn, She closed the door and checked her body carefully. Then, she immediately collapsed. It turned out that Shui Ilan, that bastard, did not only disguise her visible parts. Other than her private parts, the rest of her body was covered by that layer of old skin. In other words, even if she was unintentionally stripped naked, the exposed skin would belong to an elderly person. It would not expose her original identity. In other words, her delicate little body had been seen by that bastard while she was unconscious. It wasn't that Ning Shuima didn't know about disguise techniques, but she had never seen such a high-level disguise technique that could pass off as genuine. Not to mention other people, even she herself could not see any flaws in her disguise. She almost thought that her body was old and clumsy. Even her once proud bosom was now deflated, drooping like a ragged sack. What kind of heaven-defying disguise technique was this? Where did that bastard Shui Ilan learn such a perverted technique? It was simply turning something magical into something rotten. She was speechless to be able to make such a beautiful woman like her look like this. Ning Shuima was familiar with only two kinds of disguise techniques. One was to use drugs to blacken or yellow the skin, then use light and shadow effects to change the facial features. Thick eyebrows, small or big mouth, high or low cheekbones. These could all be done with ordinary disguise techniques. For example, Ning Shuima's appearance at the zither recital was this kind of disguise. This was the most basic thing that could not be changed. If it was someone who was very familiar with it, they would be able to recognize it at a glance. The other kind was to use the so-called human skin mask. This kind of disguise was more bloody. Ning Shuima had used this kind of disguise when she pretended to be Tui Dao. Although this kind of disguise could make one look like a completely different person, the facial expression was still stiff. It could only be fooled under the dim candlelight. But once it was exposed to the bright sunlight, it would immediately make people see that something was wrong. Ning Shuima thought that there were only these two kinds of disguise techniques in the world. Now, she finally saw another one, and it was from herself. She looked at her loose skin and took the scalpel that she had prepared beforehand. She tried to peel off the skin on the back of her hand first. She felt that Shui Ilan must have put a layer of skin on her. As long as she peeled a small hole, she should be able to tear off this eyesore of skin and restore her youthful appearance. She was a doctor who knew how to perform surgeries, so she naturally had a good grasp of the strength she used to peel off the fake skin. But when she gently cut down, she looked at the surface of the broken skin and wanted to cry. There was no second skin. This extremely flabby-looking skin was her own. Could it be that the bastard didn't disguise her, but used some sorcery to age her? After experiencing the hot spring incident, Ning Shuima had a very deep understanding of this perverted world. In this perverted world, anything could happen. Only the unthinkable could happen. There was nothing that couldn't happen. She then cut a few more parts of her body. Just like before, the skin on her body was her own skin. There was no human skin at all. How could she break this kind of disguise technique? Ning Shuima looked at her wrinkled face in the crystal mirror and only felt a buzzing in her head. Was this how she looked when she was old? Ah, she was only 13 years old. Chapter 575. Ning Shuima was only 13 years old. Was it really okay to let her see her old appearance? Was it really okay? Wasn't this too much of a challenge to her mental endurance? Ning Shuima locked herself in her room and tried all kinds of methods over and over again, but to no avail. She even took the medicine to restore her voice, but her voice was still very old and broken. Even if a person like Han Shanyue were to stay in an inn, he would stay in the best and most luxurious one. Moreover, it had to be clean and spotless. Everything had to be wiped clean, so even a fly would slip on it. Of course, the place he stayed in would definitely not have flies. In fact, there was not even a mosquito's wing in the entire inn. It was so clean that it was as if it had been thoroughly cleaned by water. Ning Shuima was actually very puzzled by his connections and methods. She had obviously decided to stay in the inn on the spur of the moment, but Han Shanyue had the means to let her stay in such a clean and high-class room after entering the city. Ning Shuima stayed in the room closer to the inside. The facilities in the room were almost comparable to the ancient version of the presidential suite. Everything that she needed for daily life could be easily obtained. She even took a medicinal bath. Of course, it did not help her skin recover at all. Ning Shuima was doing her best in the presidential suite. Han Shangyue sat at a table downstairs and drank tea. He did not need any staff. The tea set, teapot, and tea leaves were all brought by him. Even the few plates of desserts on the table were not from this inn. They were exquisite and small, and each piece of dessert was filled with a cultured aura. There was no one else in the inn. It was obvious that he had booked the whole place. The shopkeeper and staff were all in a safe corner, pretending to be invisible. They did not dare to make a sound. Of course, they were happy to be free. The money that Mr. Han gave them was enough to cover half a month of their inn's income, and he only booked it for a day. Tomorrow, they would be able to operate as usual. Why not? Money could make the devil turn millstones. Moreover, the one who paid was this Mr. Han, the new heavenly master of Chongkong country. Even if he did not pay, just the fact that he could stay here for a day was enough for them to show off. In the future, their inn's reputation would be even greater, and customers would come rolling in. Thus, these people treated Han Shangyue, the god of fortune, with an extraordinary amount of respect. They would do whatever he ordered them to do, and each of them carried out his orders more effectively than an imperial edict. Kirin was lying at Han Shanyue's feet, dozing off with his eyes closed. It originally wanted to follow Ning Shuima upstairs, but Han Shanyue's gaze froze it back. But it didn't want to go anywhere else. He decided to just lie there and watch Han Shanyue brew tea. The aroma of the tea was rich and mellow, with the refreshing air of the mountain spring. Just smelling it was enough to make one feel intoxicated. Kirin had never smelled such good tea before, and it lay there looking at him eagerly, expecting him to give it a cup. However, Han Shanyue obviously had no intention of giving it any tea. He poured himself a cup of tea and drank it leisurely. Kirin did not get any response from Han Shanyue, so it finally got angry. It laid its head on its paws and closed its eyes to sleep. It had been busy for most of the night last night, so it was really sleepy now. After lying there for a while, it groggily wanted to go see Lord Zhou. But before it could pull the Duke of Zhou's little hand, it was kicked in the butt. This kick was not strong, but it was just enough to make its butt hurt and wake it up. Chapter 576. Kirin suddenly opened its eyes and stared at Han Shanyue, the culprit. What are you doing? Not giving it tea and not allowing it to sleep? This is too inhumane. Do you really think you are a cat? Sleeping like a cat? Han Shanyue looked at it coldly. Kirin looked at its sleeping posture. It really did look like a cat. It seemed that Han Shanyue was very dissatisfied with its cat appearance and often used words to provoke it. Kirin did not want to argue with him, so it changed its position and lay on its side on the floor like a sleeping tiger. But it did not expect that just as it was about to fall asleep, it was kicked in the butt again. Under Kirin's angry eyes, Han Shanyue said lightly, "Are you the king of beasts, the Kirin? Or the tiger, the king of beasts? Don't you feel embarrassed sleeping like this?" Kirin held back for a moment. It actually wanted to bite this troublesome Master Han, but it was not his opponent. Lying on its stomach was not okay, lying on its side was not okay, so it might as well lie on its back. Isn't this how humans sleep? So Kirin simply turned its body over and slept with its limbs facing the sky. This position was not very comfortable for it. It took a long time for it to get used to it. Before it could fall asleep, Han Shanyue kicked it again. "Are you sleeping like a corpse?" The little Qilin was simply furious. How did he dislike its sleeping posture? He was obviously looking for trouble. It stared at him angrily. "What do you want?" "I can't do this. I can't do that. How do you want me to sleep?" Han Shanyue raised his hand and drank a mouthful of tea. "You dare to talk to me?" This sentence was obviously threatening and even had a hint of coldness. Kirin felt a chill in its heart. It seemed that it could not afford to offend this person. The scales that stood up because of anger slowly calmed down. It muttered, "Then how do you want me to sleep?" "You are a Kirin. Do you need me to teach you how to sleep?" Han Shanyue asked back. Kirin wanted to slap him with its claws. It never thought that sleeping was such a difficult choice. It could not sleep standing up like a crane, right? It could not sleep standing up. He was clearly looking for trouble. Kieran tilted his head and looked at him. Suddenly, a voice came from the sky. Master, are you in a bad mood? That was why he was tormenting Kieran in such a perverted manner. Han Shangyue tightened his grip on the cup and looked at it with a faint smile. Am I in a bad mood? Kieran had a bad feeling when he saw his expression. He immediately took a step back and said, Hee, maybe I was wrong. Don't take it to heart. Han Shangyue swirled the teacup in his hand and leisurely blew away the foam in the tea. I am indeed not in a good mood. Do you want to please me? How could a pervert like you be so easy to please? Kieran cursed in its heart. It cautiously took a step back. It's not easy to please a master. Little Apple doesn't have that ability. No, you have the ability. Han Shanyue's expression became even more gentle. He could even be said to be amiable. Why don't you roll a few times to make up for it? Kieran. It's not a dog. It had to roll to please its master. Not to mention that he was not its master. Just as it was trying to find another excuse, a faint noise came from outside. It seemed that there was a dispute outside. Kieran finally seized the opportunity and jumped up. Chapter 577. Someone is causing trouble outside. I'll go out and take a look. Kieran ran out like a wisp of smoke. Han Shanyue did not move. He did not need to go out and take a look to know what was going on outside. It was nothing more than another rich and overbearing person who wanted to book the entire inn. There was indeed another rich and overbearing person outside, and this rich and overbearing person was a young lady. When Kieran arrived at the entrance of the inn, the first thing she saw was a super flashy carriage. The entire carriage was carved out of an extremely expensive red sandalwood. There were countless runes engraved on it, and each rune was decorated with a luminous pearl. These luminous pearls were full and lustrous. Even though it was under the sun, they still shone with a flowing luster. These luminous pearls formed a pattern of stars surrounding the moon. It was as bright as the sea of stars. The window of the carriage was hung with the legendary Sharkman's silk that only Sharkmen could weave. It was clearly white, but when the wind blew, it looked like flowing sea waves, with unpredictable colors. In front of the carriage, there were 16 bodyguards riding on horses. They were as handsome as jade trees, and their horses were like dragons. Every one of them was smart and valiant. It was obvious that these people were well trained. The 16 of them fanned out, with a distance of 1 meter between them, not 1 meter more, not 1 meter less. They were even more orderly than soldiers during a military parade. They did not speak, nor did they move. They were as silent as a group of statues. However, the aura he exuded was enough to intimidate anyone who saw him. Smart people wouldn't dare to provoke him. The surrounding onlookers automatically retreated dozens of meters away, not daring to get close. The one who stood at the door and negotiated with the waiter was a maid dressed in green. Although she was dressed as a maid, her clothes and aura were incomparable to ordinary maids. Every move of hers was clean and crisp. The waiter understood that this group of people was not to be trifled with. But the people in the inn were even more difficult to deal with. The waiter knew this better than anyone else. So he looked as if he had just swallowed 8 bitter gourds. He earnestly explained to the maid, I'm sorry, miss. The inn has been booked. Please go to another inn. The maid in green smiled coldly. How much did he use? We will pay double. The waiter shook his head. Miss, I'm sorry. Even if you pay 3 times the price, it won't work. Please go to another house. You really don't know what's good for you. You can't make the decision on this matter. Call your shopkeeper out. The servant girl in green clothes didn't want to be long-winded with the waiter. The waiter also felt that he really couldn't handle it. One of them quickly ran inside and asked the shopkeeper to come out. The shopkeeper's expression changed when he saw the carriage. He paused, flicked his sleeves, and bowed to the carriage. I didn't know it was the 8th Commandery Princess. Please forgive me for not welcoming you. He bowed deeply, and only one word came out from the carriage. you're excused." The voice was crisp and carried a natural nobility. The servant girl in green immediately said, "Innkeeper, since you know that it's our princess, then can we take over your inn? We can give you 3 times the price." The shopkeeper's heart was incomparably bitter. In this small city, there weren't many high officials and nobles, and there weren't many who came to stay in the inn. His guest room was usually half full. Now, the god of fortune had finally arrived. Chapter 578. Now that the inn finally had the god of wealth, there were 2 of them. Neither of them could tolerate the other. It would have been better if they had split the trip into 2 days. Now, he had to give up on one of them. If it was not Han Shangyue who was in the inn, he might be tempted by the one who offered him 3 times the price. But it was Han Shangyue. Even if the one who came later offered him 10 times or 100 times the price, he would not agree, let alone 3 times the price. So, he rejected the offer in a euphemistic way. Because Han Shangyue didn't ask him to identify himself, the innkeeper didn't dare to say who was in the inn. He could only bow and beg them to go to another inn. He could help them find the next one and guarantee that everything would be fine and so on. He was polite and euphemistic, but the maid in green did not buy it. She said coldly, "Our 8th commandery princess wants to stay in the best inn. She doesn't want anything less than that. You ask the guest to come out. I will negotiate with him. We will pay him 10 times the price. I promise he will move." The innkeeper did not move. He just bowed to the carriage and said, Sorry. Please don't make things difficult for me." Obviously, he did not dare to go into the inn and ask the guest to come out. Although he did not mention Han Shanyue's name, his actions showed that the guest in the inn had a powerful background. He was even more powerful than the 8th commandery princess. The maid in green wanted to say something more, but the door of the carriage suddenly opened. Everyone saw a girl come out of the carriage. The girl looked delicate and pretty. She was wearing a black dress with flowers on it. The dress spun and spread out as she jumped down, like a flower flying in the wind. When the crowd saw the girl, they all had the same thought. So this was the famous 8th commandery princess. They did not expect her to be so beautiful. They widened their eyes and wanted to take a closer look. Unexpectedly, the girl threw out a roll of light muslin. The light muslin landed on the ground and spread out like a carpet to the entrance of the inn. After doing all this, the girl bowed to the people in the carriage and said, "Princess, you can get off now." Everyone was speechless. Their eyes were wide open. The girl who came out was not the 8th commandery princess, but one of her maidservants. This display of extravagance wasn't just an ordinary level of grandeur. Even Kieran, who was hiding behind the door to watch the show, widened his eyes and felt his blood boil. Haha, someone came to challenge that pervert Han Shanyue. It didn't want to miss out on the fun. It wanted to see who the 8th commandery princess was. She was so cool. After the maid finished speaking, she lowered her body. A figure flashed in the carriage and a purple-clothed girl appeared. Purple was a light gauze purple, like smoke or fog. No one could tell what material her clothes were made of, but everyone could tell that the origin of this material was not simple. Perhaps every inch of it was made of gold. This young girl's face was also covered with a light purple veil, revealing only her eyes. The crowd couldn't see the girl's appearance clearly, but from her ink-like black hair, her extremely graceful figure, and her aura, they knew that this girl was extraordinary. The girl who got off the car first had already stunned everyone, but the girl who came out later made everyone hold their breaths. The 8th commandery princess. This was the 8th commandery princess Ming Wan, who was born in the Bright King's mansion and was the younger sister of the current Bright King. She was famous for being the #1 genius in the power of fire. Chapter 579. Everyone's gaze was on the 8th princess, but the little Cheelant's gaze was attracted by the cat in her bosom. The cat was lying lazily in the arms of the 8th commandery princess. It was as big as a Persian cat and as fluffy as a snowball. It squinted its sapphire-like eyes and looked very lively. Perhaps the cat had sensed the little Kylan's gaze, so it looked at the little Kylan. It stared at the little Kylan for a moment, and then moved away proudly. It snorted and rubbed its head against the 8th Commandery Princess's chest, then continued to sleep lazily. Kieran was speechless. This cat was not afraid of him at all. One had to know that all the beasts in the world would submit to the Qilin when they saw it. Even the domestic animals that had yet to gain intelligence would be so obedient when they saw it. How dare this cat ignore him? The 8th Commandery Princess jumped up and gently stepped on the maid's back. Then she landed on the ground leisurely. She walked into the shop and said, "I'm going to talk to that customer." She had a kind of aura, an aura that no one dared to disobey. Moreover, as soon as she got off the carriage, the 16 bodyguards automatically surrounded her and escorted her into the store with large strides. The shopkeeper did not dare to stop her. Even if he wanted to, he could not get close to her. He complained in his heart and said, "8th Commandery Princess, please wait. You really can't disturb that person." It was time for a fight. It was time for a fight. Someone was going to challenge Guru Han. Little Qilin was in high spirits and followed behind the crowd. When it came out to watch the fight, it shrunk itself to the size of a poodle to avoid being too shocking. It had been hiding in the dark, so no one noticed it. However, the cat in the arms of the 8th Commandery Princess stared at it several times. In the hall, Han Shangyue was still drinking tea. When the 8th Commandery Princess and the others came in, he did not seem to hear them at all. He poured and drank by himself, enjoying himself. The crowd saw him as soon as they came in, and then they all stopped in their tracks. In the hall, the aroma of tea rose in spirals. The aroma was faint, and in the rising tea mist, a white-clothed man sat faintly. They couldn't see his features clearly, and they couldn't even see his figure clearly. However, he gave off an extremely handsome and young feeling for no reason. More importantly, the aura that surrounded him was like the clouds floating in the sky. He didn't seem like someone from the mortal world. He was just sitting there, doing nothing. He didn't even look in their direction, but everyone who came in was as silent as cicadas in winter. They didn't even dare to breathe loudly. There seemed to be faint music playing in the hall. How could this be the hall of an ordinary inn? It was more like a legendary immortal's cave. The 8th Commandery Princess, Ming Wan, also stopped. She looked at Han Shangyue with a complicated expression. She finally understood why the innkeeper did not agree to drive away the guests. No one in the world would dare to chase away this guest, so it is Heavenly Master Han. Mingwan did not know and has offended you. Princess Mingwan bowed. Although she was impetuous, she was not a reckless person. She knew clearly who she could offend and who she couldn't. Han Shangyue didn't look at her. He just raised his hand and took a sip of tea. He didn't seem to care about her. He was used to being indifferent. There were not many people or things in the world that could attract his attention, so he wouldn't care. Chapter 580. The 8th Commandery Princess was not annoyed. She gave the maid beside her a look. The maid was clever. She immediately took out an exquisite box and opened it. The box was covered with brocade. On the brocade, there was a red Ganoderma lucidum. "Sir, this is a 1,000-year-old Ganoderma lucidum. Please accept it." The onlookers all secretly sucked in a breath of cold air. A 1,000-year-old Ganoderma lucidum. It was a precious herb in this world. It had powerful functions and was the dream of many practitioners. It was so rare that even the imperial palace might not have many of them. Moreover, this one looked like a top-quality herb. Even if one had the money, they would not be able to buy it. Now, the 8th Commandery Princess gave away such a precious Ganoderma lucidum without even blinking her eyes. She was indeed a member of the Bright King family. She was extraordinarily rich. Han Shangyue finally looked at her and said calmly, "Do you want to exchange it with me?" The 8th Commandery Princess smiled and said, "No, this is a gift for you. I apologize for my rudeness just now." "Huh." Han Shangyue replied lightly. He did not intend to take the box and said, "You don't want anything from me?" Ming Wan's eyes flashed and she bowed again. "I only admire you. I don't want anything from you. Of course, if you are willing, Can you give me a place to stay in this inn? I promise that I only need a few rooms, and I will not disturb you. If you agree to my request, I will also give you 1,000-year-old Chinese knotweed." The others were stunned. This Infanta Ming one had really spent a lot of money just to stay in this inn. She was indeed the daughter of a rich family. She was so capricious. Even Kieran secretly gave her a thumbs up. She was awesome. It seemed that the Bright King Mansion was not inferior to the imperial family. The 8th Commandery Princess's status was also much higher than Ji Yunyao's. She spent a lot of money just to get a place in an inn in a small town. The crowd was speechless. Han Shanyue had turned around to drink his tea. He was not interested in the 1,000-year-old Ganoderma lucidum or the 1,000-year-old Chinese knotweed. He also did not want to share the limelight with others in the same inn. Just as he was about to speak, a voice suddenly came from the stairwell. "We're changing." The voice was old and hoarse. It was the voice of an old woman. Everyone raised their heads in surprise and saw an old granny over 70 years old standing on the stairs. Her hair was white, and she wore a green silk dress. Her hair was combed into an old person's bun. Although her old face was full of wrinkles, one could faintly see that she was extremely beautiful when she was young. Even now, as she stood there, she was clearly no longer youthful, but she still had a kind of majesty, a majesty that no one could underestimate. Even if she was an old lady, she was still a graceful and elegant old lady. Other than the shopkeeper and the shop assistant, everyone who came in widened their eyes in disbelief. Wasn't this inn reserved by Heavenly Master Han Shan and Yuhan? Where did this old lady come from? Everyone knew that Master Han Yuhan had a serious obsession with cleanliness. When he stayed in the inn, he would always reserve the entire place and not allow any outsiders to enter. Now, in the inn that he had booked, there was such an old lady walking out so openly. Just this point alone was enough to shock everyone. Everyone looked at her as if they had seen a Tyrannosaurus Rex suddenly appear in the city. Their eyes were filled with disbelief. Chapter 581. Everyone's eyes were filled with disbelief. Even Princess Ming-Wan was stunned. For a moment, she did not know how to react. However, what was even more unbelievable was still to come. Han Shanyue, who had always been cold and disdained to look at anyone, was now looking at the old woman. There was even a hint of a smile in his eyes. "How is it?" The one who came down the stairs was naturally Ning Xuema. She had been tormenting herself until now, but there was no result at all. She finally gave up. Hearing the movement downstairs, she changed her clothes and came out. She had to say that Han Shanyue had foresight. He had ordered people to prepare clothes for her for the elderly, and the clothes were simple and fitted, as if they were made for Ning Xuema. After she was dressed properly, she secretly gritted her teeth. It seemed that this great Master Han had a very accurate grasp of a person's size. Hearing Han Shanyue's question, she spread out her hands. "As you can see, I still look like a bear." Han Shanyue's mood seemed to have improved. His fingers leisurely twirled the teacup. "Perhaps you have other methods to try?" Ning Xuema shook her head. No. She had tried all the methods she knew. Her skin had been cut a few times, and now it was still burning. "Then you are prepared to stay like this?" Han Shanyue smiled faintly. How could this be? She would rather die than stay like this? Ning Xuema went up and sat opposite him. She picked up the teapot on the table and poured herself a cup. She drank it all in one gulp and put the teacup down. She looked at him like a cat. "You have a way, right?" Han Shanyue picked up his teapot and did not answer her question. Instead, he said something unrelated. "Good tea needs to be tasted. You are drinking it like a cow." Him avoiding this topic proved that he had a way. Ning Xuema's eyes lit up. In order to return to her beautiful self, she immediately threw away her prideful integrity. She picked up the teapot and poured a cup for him. Of course, she didn't forget to pour a cup for herself. "I've learned a lot. I'll drink it gracefully right now." She picked up the teacup and took a sip, looking very elegant. Han Shanyue glanced at her and said coldly, "You did it on purpose. Why was he so troublesome?" Ning Xuema gritted her teeth inwardly. but since she was the one asking for help, she couldn't raise her voice to him. He paused for a moment before picking up the teacup in front of him and attentively placing it in his hands. Then, he said sincerely, "In the future, I'll try my best to drink my tea as smoothly as the clouds and flowing water." "Oh right, great God, you have a way to break that perverse spell, right?" Han Shangyue seemed to be satisfied with her attentiveness. He gave her face and took a sip, but his answer kicked Ning Xuema into the abyss. There's no other way. Ning Xuema. Even he couldn't do anything? Then, was she going to live with this face in the future? Heavens, she might as well be struck by divine lightning. She felt uneasy and her hand trembled. Some of the tea spilled out and wet her hand. The tea ran down the back of her hand. Han Shangyue couldn't stand it. He took out a handkerchief from nowhere and threw it to her. "Wipe?" Ning Xuema picked up the handkerchief with a bitter face and wiped the back of her hand carelessly. She didn't wipe very carefully. After wiping, she put the handkerchief on the table. She raised her head and was about to say something when a hand reached over and grabbed her wrist. Her hand that was splashed with tea was pulled over. Chapter 582. Han Shangyue looked at Ning Xuema's hand, which was obviously stained with tea. He frowned unhappily. "You can't even wipe this clean?" Then, he took out a handkerchief and wiped her hand carefully. He didn't even let go of the cleavage in her wrinkles. He was a clean freak, so he wiped Ning Xuema's hand until it was much cleaner than if it had been washed with soap. He even wiped the age spots on the back of her hand until they turned red. He only let go of her when he was sure that her hand was clean. Then, he slowly added, "I can't cure it, but it doesn't mean that I don't know who can cure it." This bastard was simply taking a breather. Ning Xuema's heart, which had sunk to the bottom of the abyss, was pulled out again. She decisively hugged one of his arms. "Guru, then take me to find this person." Han Shangyue retracted his arm in disgust. "Don't touch me." Her face was full of wrinkles, and acting cute to him made his hair stand on end. However, his mood was inexplicably better. Ning Xuema was irritated by his disgusted expression. "You don't want me to touch you because you think I'm ugly, right? If you don't take me to find him, I'll just disgust you." She rushed forward and held his hand again. She sincerely discussed with him, "Guru, you are my future husband. If I keep looking like this, I'll embarrass you, right? So, you have to find a way to cure me as soon as possible." Bang! The sound of something falling to the ground was heard. Ning Xuema looked back and saw that everyone was collectively petrified. Even the 8th Commandery Princess, who was smooth and slick in dealing with people, looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her maid was so shocked that she dropped the box in her hand. The lid of the box was opened, revealing the 1,000-year-old Chinese knotweed inside. Ning Xuema finally realized that there were so many people watching. She calmly went forward and picked up the Chinese knotweed. Although the box fell to the ground, the Chinese knotweed was still intact. Not a single strand of hair was missing. The other maid was still holding the box with the 1,000-year-old blood Ganoderma lucidum. Ning Xuema took it and looked at it. She was sure that it was genuine. She immediately smiled and patted the 8th Commandery Princess's shoulder. "Your suggestion just now was very good. I agree on his behalf." The 8th Commandery Princess finally came to her senses. She looked at Ning Xuema with a complicated expression and said, "Senior." Her mind was in a state of dizziness as if she had been struck by lightning. In her mind, she was still desperately thinking, "Heavens, this old lady is actually the godlike Honorable Master Han's wife." This old lady was actually Master Han's wife. It was too horrifying. It was too shocking. She definitely wouldn't believe it if someone else said that. But now, she saw it with her own eyes. Moreover, this Master Han, who was difficult to approach, was very special to this old lady. He actually allowed her to get so close to him and even wiped her hands for her. Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! What was wrong with the world? Her eyes lit up as if she had seen some gossip. After Ning Xuema came to this world, she had been addressed by many different names. Little girl, stinky girl, little girl, and so on. It was the first time that someone had called her senior. It made her feel a sense of vicissitudes. She raised her hand to touch her wrinkled face and gently patted the 8th Commandery Princess's shoulder. She smiled kindly and said, "Little girl, the condition you mentioned just now is fair, so we have a deal. We accept your 2 gifts. How many rooms can you live in?" Chapter 583. However, I see that you have quite a number of people, and I'm afraid that a few rooms won't be enough. I'm sorry to have to trouble the 8th princess. I have an idea that will allow the 8th princess and your subordinates to live comfortably. Would you like to hear it? Ming Wan was still in a daze and asked subconsciously, "What idea?" Ning Shuama smiled kindly. "We are old, and we don't want to be calculative with the younger generation. We might as well let you have the entire inn and let you live comfortably. However, as compensation, you have to agree to a small condition." Ming Wan asked subconsciously, "What condition? Why don't you give us your carriage as well? Mr. Han is currently lacking a means of transportation, so your carriage is barely passable. But with a small horse carriage, you can book the entire inn and let Mr. Han give up his seat for you. Isn't that a good deal? Since you don't deny it, does that mean you agree?" Ming Wan was still in a daze and did not know what to say. You are indeed a smart and decisive girl. Then you agree." Ning Shuama turned around and waved at Han Shanyue. "Husband," she agreed. "Let's just give the inn to this little girl and find another inn. It's the same." Han Shanyue was speechless. Ming Wan was speechless. 15 minutes later, Ning Shuema was sitting comfortably in the magnificent horse carriage. Ming Wan's belongings had already been moved out of the carriage. However, the interior of the carriage was luxurious and comfortable. Ning Shuema leaned against a brocade couch and felt very comfortable. Han Shanyue sat opposite her, half leaning against the side of the carriage and looked very relaxed. Of course, with his extreme misophobia, although the interior of the carriage was originally clean enough, he still used the cleaning spell to erase all the auras belonging to Princess Ming Wan and the others. Now, the air in the carriage was as fresh as the wilderness after the rain. Just a breath was refreshing. Here, it had to be said that Princess Ming Wan was very understanding and smooth in dealing with people. After she gave her priceless carriage to the Ning Shuama couple in her half-petrified state, although she regretted it so much that she wanted to bleed, she didn't show it on her face. She might as well help them all the way to the end, and even gave them a stable boy with excellent driving skills. Now, the carriage was moving on the wide street. The sound of the carriage was crisp and clear, tinkling as it moved forward. Kirin did not dare to transform into a cat in front of Han Shanyue. In order to stay in the carriage, it shrunk its body to the size of a small poodle. It curled up on a brocade stool, and finally had a good night's sleep. With its master here, it believed that Han Shanyue would not kick it because of its improper sleeping posture. Ning Shuama was in a good mood because she was out of danger, and there was hope for her appearance to recover. Last night, she was carried here and there by Shui Ilan. Although she was tired, Shui Ilan was even more tired than her. After all, she was the one who was carried. Later on, Shui Ilan was afraid that she would play tricks again, so he simply knocked her out. She actually slept through the night. When she was driving the carriage, she was only a little nervous, but she was not tired. Also, because she had taken a good bath, she was now very energetic. Sitting in the carriage, Ning Shuama looked at the green mountains and trees on both sides of the road and felt very comfortable. Chapter 584. Sitting in the carriage and looking at the green trees on both sides, she felt more comfortable and could not help but sing, "You are my little apple, little apple." While singing, she patted Kirin's back. Although her voice was not pleasant to hear, it was not out of tune. When she sang properly, it was still worth listening to. Kirin listened for a moment and was moved to tears. It hugged her hand with its little paws. "Master, you even composed a song for me." That was not the case. Ning Shuema smiled and did not say anything. She did not want to hurt Kieran's weak little heart. She just patted its back. She looked at Han Shanyue. He was leaning against the seat with his eyes closed. She did not know if he was resting or meditating. There was only her singing and Kieran's occasional snoring in the carriage. The sun shone through the gauze and jumped on Kieran's back. It gave people a feeling of peace and warmth. Ning Shuima suddenly felt that this kind of life was not bad. The world was peaceful, and she did not need to live in fear. With this great God here, her heart could finally be at peace. She did not need to be nervous all the time. She just did not know how long this relationship could last. 3 months? 2 months? 3 years? 2 years? Or maybe a lifetime? She was shocked by her last thought. How could she have this kind of thought? He only used her as a shield, and she only thought of him as her temporary support. It was just a relationship of mutual benefit. How could it last a lifetime? She had experienced too many things recently, so her brain was a bit off and she was thinking about these things. Senior, where are you going? The stable boy outside asked. The carriage had already left the city, and there was a fork in the road. The stable boy did not know their destination, so he asked. Ning Shuima looked at Han Shanyue's face. Great God, where are we going? Han Shanyue did not open his eyes. Anywhere? Big brother, don't be so casual. Don't you want to take me to a master to undo this disguise? Ning Shuima inwardly sucked in a breath of air. She continued to smile at him. Where does the great master of disguise live? Han Shanyue still did not open his eyes. When did I agree to take you to him? Ning Shuima was speechless. She paused for a moment before moving closer to him. Her sudden approach finally made Han Shanyue open his eyes. Her old face enlarged in front of him. He quietly moved back. Why did you suddenly come closer? Ning Shuima sincerely looked at him. Great God, in the future, we might be able to interact with each other for a long time. If I keep showing my old face in front of you, you won't feel comfortable, right? Even if I become your shield, I won't be able to intimidate you. Why don't you find a way to restore my appearance? Not only will you be pleasing to the eyes, you'll also have a lot of face when you go out, right? No matter how good your face is, it's just a face's face. Why do you care so much about your appearance? Han Shanyue pushed her old face away, twirling a white jade flute in his hand, his posture leisurely and languid. He looked at her again. If this girl became like this, there might be fewer peach blossoms flying around and she could concentrate on practicing. Or maybe he would not take her to find that person. He began to seriously consider this possibility. Ning Shuima was cursing in her heart. Damn it, she was only 13 years old. She did not want to become a face's face. Chapter 585. If he didn't care about his appearance, why did he look like a gigolo? Why didn't he look like an uncle? However, looking at Han Shanyue's expression, he didn't seem to be willing to bring her to find him. Ning Shuima made up her mind and threw herself on him. She hugged his waist and pushed her head up to his chin. Almighty, look, don't you think I look scary like this? It was indeed scary. Han Shanyue resisted the urge to slap her away. He pulled her hands away and said bluntly, you will look like this sooner or later. He could already tell that her current appearance was what she would look like when she was older. People will die sooner or later. You can't just strangle a child when he is born, right? Ning Shuima tried to reason with him. The beauty of life lies in the process, not in the ending that you already know. It was like reading a novel. The reader was looking at the ups and downs of the plot, and the warmth and laughter. Even tears were a kind of beauty. It was not a happy ending that everyone knew. Han Shanyue raised his eyebrows. At this moment, she was sticking close to him like a dog's skin plaster, but he didn't feel particularly annoyed. He even thought it was funny when he saw her white head. If other old ladies were to stick close to him like this, he would probably have slapped them out of the Milky Way. He had never been so close to anyone in his life, let alone hugging his waist. Only this little girl was an exception. Was this also a kind of fate? Han Shanyue looked down at her. What you said seems to make some sense. Ning Shuima saw that his tone had loosened, so she immediately continued, what you said is very reasonable. You see, I'm only 13 years old. I'm like a flower that has just bloomed and hasn't bloomed in the wind. If it withered and withered, wouldn't it be too unfair? It also goes against the natural law of life. Han Shangyue pushed her face away. Why are you blooming? Attracting bees and butterflies? SK. When did she attract bees and butterflies? She was always unlucky and despised by all kinds of people, okay? Although she did attract some young masters, it proved that her personality was too charming. Even with the title of being a loner, she could still attract suitors, although most of them were rotten suitors. Wait, he didn't want to restore her appearance because he was afraid that she would attract bees and butterflies? Was he jealous? No, he wouldn't. This almighty probably didn't know what jealousy meant. A person like him wouldn't be jealous of anyone. It should be his possessiveness, right? After all, she had the title of his concubine. If there were too many men around her, he would feel like he had a green hat hanging above his head. She raised her hand. Great God, I swear, during the time I'm your shield concubine, I won't take the initiative to meet with other men. Of course, if those men came to find her, it wouldn't count as her breaking the oath. In order to restore her original appearance, she was going all out. Han Shangyue's her. Hayes my, T.S.'s green hat. Han Shangyue simply crossed his arms and looked at her without saying a word. Ars say ts agree or agree ts sd have ts have, s he's, then Shangyue finally opened his mouth. Did I say I wouldn't take you to see a doctor? He looked out the window and said again, aren't we on the road to Carefree Island? Chapter 586. Ning Shuema. It turned out that he had already agreed, causing her to make a vow in vain. She looked at him. Can the person you spoke of really undo my appearance-changing technique? If that person couldn't undo it, then her vow would have been in vain. Han Shangyue looked at her and honestly replied, I don't know. That person was the ancestor of appearance-changing techniques. If he couldn't undo it, then she really had to pray for her own good fortune. Ning Shuema. Ning Shuema didn't know where Carefree Island was. She had never heard of it before. Even the stable boy outside was confused. Fortunately, with Han Shangyue guiding the way, the carriage wouldn't go astray. Ning Shuema secretly memorized the road. It wasn't a bad idea to recognize the road to the strange people's home. In the future, when she was traveling alone and encountered similar difficulties, she could ask for help. Han Shangyue ignored her and closed his eyes to meditate. The journey was long, and the scenery along the way was nothing to write home about. Ning Shuema leaned against the window and began to feel sleepy. If you're sleepy, then take a rest. I'll call you when we arrive. A calm voice came from behind her. Perhaps she was really sleepy, or perhaps his words had an effect, but Ning Shuema's body slowly softened. A moment later, she had fallen asleep on the brocade mattress. Ning Shuema had a bad habit of hugging something when she was sleeping. The little Qilin was lying not far from her. While she was sleeping, she would pull the unconscious little Qilin into her bosom and hug it as if she was hugging a doll. Kirin nestled in her arms and naturally felt comfortable. It groggily snuggled into her embrace, but before it could find the most comfortable position, its body suddenly tightened. Before it could react to what was going on, its entire body had already flown out of the car window like it was riding on clouds and mist. With a thud, it fell flat on its back. This time, its sleepiness was completely gone. Kirin jumped up from the ground and glared angrily at the departing carriage. Stop! It was a divine beast, the Qilin. It also had a temper when it woke up. It was already angry when it was woken up from its deep sleep, let alone being thrown out like this. Its howl caused the horse pulling the carriage to tremble. It staggered and almost fell down, causing the carriage to jolt as well. Ning Shuema was jolted and rolled around in the carriage. Fortunately, the cushion under her body was thick and soft enough, so she didn't bump into anything. Her body touched something soft and hard. It was warm and had a faint fragrance. She instinctively reached out to hug him. When the thing moved slightly, she hugged it even tighter and muttered, "Be good. don't run." As expected, that thing stopped moving. Satisfied, she pulled the thing into her arms and rubbed her face against it. Only then did she fall asleep contentedly. Han Shangyue lowered his eyes and looked at her. He endured for a while, but in the end, he didn't withdraw his leg. He only coldly sent a message to Kirin, who was almost bristling with anger. "Follow behind. If you scare the horse, I'll put you on it." Kirin was speechless. The waves rolled and crashed against the shore. The sound of the waves was endless. Ning Xuema was woken up by the sound of the waves. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in an awkward situation. Han Shangyue was sitting beside her, and she was hugging his leg like a koala bear. "Hey, when did she sleep so freely?" Ning Xuema's face was hot. Chapter 587. Ning Xuema blushed and loosened her grip. She rolled to the side and yawned as if she had just woken up. She sat up and asked, "Are we almost there?" Han Shangyue calmly retracted his leg. His leg was a bit stiff after being hugged by her for so long. He looked out the window and said, "Let's get off." The two of them got off and sent the carriage away. Naturally, the stable boy drove the carriage back to the inn. Ning Xuema stood on the shore and looked at the sea and sky. Seagulls flew up and down on the sea, but she couldn't even see the shadow of an island. "Great God, where is the carefree island you mentioned? Should we hire a boat?" Ning Xuema looked around. This place was very desolate, and she couldn't even see the shadow of a boat. "No need. Close your eyes." Han Shangyue quietly hugged her waist. Ning Xuema's heart skipped a beat. This was the first time he had taken the initiative to hug her, however. She also knew that this action didn't mean that he was being intimate with her, but that he was about to use a spell. Was he going to fly with her? Or was the place where the master lived extremely secretive, and he was afraid that she would recognize the way, so he wanted her to close her eyes? Great God, can I not close my eyes? Ning Xuema actually wanted to see the scenery along the way. Han Shangyue glanced at her and said, "Up to you." He held her with his left arm, and his right hand quickly moved in the air. His speed wasn't fast. Ning Xuema watched his movements with wide eyes and silently memorized the steps. His fingertips flashed with white light. The white light gradually took shape like the 8 trigrams. A moment later, the bright 8 trigrams reached the place where the sea and the sky connected. A cloud road slowly extended from the horizon. How magical! Ning Xuema saw the road extend to her feet and couldn't help but step on it. Be careful. Her feet seemed to be pulled by something. The road was like a whirlwind, sucking her in. A 360-degree flip, a 720-degree backflip. Ning Xuema felt as if she had fallen into a high-speed washing machine. Her body was spinning irregularly like a whirlwind, making her dizzy. Not to mention seeing the scenery along the way, it was difficult for her to even open her eyes. She didn't expect that such a beautiful cloud path would be so fierce after stepping on it. It was as if she was riding a furious dragon. Fortunately, her hand was still in Han Shanyue's hand, and she was not swept away. This made her feel more at ease. The only thing that made her feel a little strange was that she clearly saw him rolling around with her, but his clothes were not messed up at all. His expression was also as if he was strolling leisurely, and he did not seem to be in a sorry state at all. After tumbling for an unknown amount of time, her body finally rushed out of the cloud path vortex. She was actually in midair. She couldn't keep her balance and fell straight down. Suddenly, his body tightened, as if he had been pulled into someone's embrace. The feeling of the sky and earth spinning finally disappeared, and her feet lightly touched the ground. Although she stabilized her body, her head was still dizzy. Her stomach felt like it was overturning mountains and seas, and she was about to vomit at any moment. It was so uncomfortable that she couldn't open her eyes. A palm pressed on her back, and a faint warm current entered her body, calming her blood that was about to go berserk. After a moment, the dizziness and nausea finally disappeared. Ning Xuema opened her eyes. Then, she was stunned. The place she was standing on was indeed an island. It was an island filled with the aura of the south. Chapter 588. The snow-white beach, the tall coconut trees, and the tall trees with wide leaves in the distance were lush and green. Not far away, a man wearing a snow-white inner garment and a wide sapphire-blue gauze robe was standing not far away. He was waving a flirtatious fan in his hand and looking at them in surprise. To be exact, he was looking at Han Shangyue. After Ning Shuima saw the man's appearance clearly, she only gave him a precise evaluation of a flirtatious demon. He looked at them as if he was looking at a mirror. He was so surprised that he forgot to wave the fan in his hand. After a while, he muttered a few words. Is the 1,000-year-old sago tree about to bloom? Han Shangyue looked at him indifferently. Rongyu? What did you say? Rongyu? The name was quite elegant, and it also matched the man's flirtatious appearance. Ning Shuima evaluated in her heart. The man named Rongyu touched his nose. He laughed dryly. Nothing much. He strode over and looked at Ning Shuima from head to toe. He then circled her twice, as if he was evaluating her weight. Ning Shuima stood there generously and let him size her up. After a while, Rongyu praised, exquisite, superb workmanship. Ning Shuima was speechless. She naturally knew that Rongyu was praising her disguise technique. Since he could see it at first sight, did that mean that he could solve it? Han Shangyue was more straightforward. Stop talking nonsense. Rongyu, can you solve this disguise technique? The man was naturally Rongyu Tianlan. He circled Ning Shuima again and sighed. Such a perfect masterpiece. I can't bear to destroy it. Ning Shuima's lips twitched slightly. She was now so ugly, and it was still perfect? A masterpiece? Could she give such a perfect masterpiece to him? Could she not paste it on him? Rongyu Tianlan was still waving her fan and sighing. This makeup may be extremely ugly in your eyes, but in the eyes of an expert like me, it's simply like a peerless painting. Even the slightest damage will destroy its imperfections. It's like burning a zither and cooking a crane, spoiling the scenery. Ning Shuima smiled sincerely. Thank you for your praise, Your Excellency. However, this little girl is a common person and cannot appreciate this kind of style. I hope Your Excellency can display your wonderful skill and help this little girl undo this disguise. I can't thank you enough. Han Shangyue was the most direct. You think this style is good? I'll use this on you later. Rangi Yuishinlin's handsome face darkened. Dizwa, can you not attack my weak spot? Of course, he only said this in his heart. He didn't dare to say it out loud. He rubbed his nose and said, All right, I'll do something that spoils the fun. I'll help this young lady remove her disguise. However, there is a problem. I still need to discuss it with the two of you. What's the problem? Han Shangyue raised his eyebrows. Rangi Yuishinlin looked sloppy, but he was very proud of his work. Any kind of problem could be easily solved in his hands. It wasn't easy for the word problem to come out of his mouth. Rangi Yuishinlin glanced at Ning Shuima and laughed. This is not the place to talk. Let's go to Huanhua Palace to talk. Just as he said this, he suddenly stopped. He looked not far away and rubbed his eyebrows. There are quite a lot of visitors today. On the snow-white beach, the blue Kirin appeared out of thin air. It looked like it had crawled out of a washing machine. Its tail was clamped and its eyes were covered. Chapter 589. After it appeared, it staggered a few steps before falling down with a plop. It shook its head and got up, then took another 2 steps before falling down again. As if it were drunk, Ning Shuima couldn't help but laugh as she saw Kirin's appearance. If it weren't for Han Shanyue's help, she would have fallen even more than Kirin did. Little Apple, how are you feeling? Ning Shuima walked over to its side. Kirin's 2 claws tightly held onto her. My head is dizzy. That whirlpool was too strong. I fell from the sky. I thought I would be half dead. Ning Shuima was stunned. She had clearly seen it appear on the beach out of thin air. How did it become falling? She suddenly thought of something. She looked at herself, and her heart skipped a beat. Just now, she had been spinning in the whirlpool like that. Logically speaking, her clothes and hair should have been in a mess. But she looked at herself. Her clothes were neat, and her hair was not messy. How did she look like she had just spun out of the whirlpool? Could it be that the whirlpool just now was just an illusion? Sure enough, before she could ask Han Shangyue for confirmation, Rangi Yuishinlin waved his fan and said, "Mister," he was a bit tongue-tied when he called Han Shangyue, as if he wasn't used to it. He coughed and said, "Brother Shangyue, why didn't you let them close their eyes when you brought them in?" With their cultivation, if they didn't close their eyes, they would have been mesmerized by the illusions. Han Shangyue glanced at Ning Shuima and lightly said, "They brought it upon themselves." Ning Shuima, Che, she didn't know. Would he have died if he had said a few more words? Kirin was still holding onto her skirt to get rid of the dizziness. Ning Shuima was a bit puzzled. Wasn't this little guy a god beast? Why was it dizzier than her? That Rangi Yuishinlin was also a very understanding person. He seemed to understand Ning Shuima's doubts and explained to her, "The enchantment around my carefree island is not something that anyone can casually enter. You have to use your telekinesis to break the barrier when you enter, and it's best if you have someone you're familiar with to hold your hand when you enter, so that you won't feel dizzy. This Qilin beast isn't being held by you guys, but it's following behind by itself." It didn't know how to close its eyes, so naturally, it felt even dizzier. It's already very capable that it didn't faint. It turned out that there were so many das. Ning Shuima expressed that she was enlightened, but at the same time, she glanced at Han Shangyue with disdain. If he had explained things to her back then, she and Kirin would not have ended up like this. Han Shangyue casually turned around and said, "Let's go." The group of people walked towards the building not far away. A deep thought flashed through Rangi Yuishinlin's eyes. This was the first time he had seen someone talk to Dizwa like this, and it was also the first time he had seen Dizwa bring someone over, let alone an ordinary person. It was also the first time he had seen Dizwa hold hands with someone, and he had even quietly hugged her. He knew Dizwa's obsession with cleanliness better than anyone else. When they were playing chess, whenever their fingers accidentally touched, Dizwa would use a cleansing technique to clean it. If Yunshi unintentionally pulled on his sleeve, he would also quietly change his clothes. This Dizwa, who was so obsessed with cleanliness that even gods and men hated him, would naturally get close to an ordinary girl. Although he had always been cold to the girl, he didn't reject her approach. He even took the initiative to approach her, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Concubine. Perhaps in Dizwa's eyes, this girl wasn't as simple as a concubine. He had never heard of anyone's concubine receiving such treatment. Chapter 590. His gaze fell on Ning Shuima's body, as if he was trying his best to see through her aged appearance to see her true beauty. What kind of stunning beauty could receive such special treatment from Dizwa? He waved his fan and walked side by side with Ning Shuima, sizing her up from time to time. His charming peach blossom eyes occasionally flashed with a sharp light. It was as if there was an X-ray hidden in them that could see through a person's entire body. Usually, people who were stared at by him would feel somewhat uncomfortable, and some would even feel so uneasy that they wouldn't know where to put their hands and feet. Even Yunshi would blush unnaturally when he stared at her like this, and she would punch him with her small fist. However, Ning Shuima wasn't like that. She walked confidently with a calm expression, and she even smiled at him. Although her aged face didn't have any beauty when she smiled, he could read two words from that smile: natural charm. This girl wasn't simple. Perhaps she had really met her match, and a strong one at that. He had an impulse to light a candle for his good friend. He was sizing up Ning Shuima, and Ning Shuima was naturally sizing him up in her heart. His gaze had a penetrating quality, and once it focused on someone, that person would feel very uncomfortable. Naturally, Ning Shuima also felt his gaze. However, ever since she was young, she had experienced too many different kinds of gazes. Moreover, she was once an outstanding Secret Service agent and had received training in this field. Under any kind of probing gaze, she would not reveal her emotions. Even hypnotism was unable to hypnotize her. she was naturally immune to Rongyu Tianlan's gaze. Even if he had the Sharingan from Naruto, she wouldn't lose her composure, let alone the legendary electric eye. This man's appearance was naturally outstanding. Compared to Han Shangyue and Shuilan, these two extremely beautiful men, he wasn't inferior at all. Han Shanyue's beauty was like the snow at the top of the clouds, cold and powerful, like a high and mighty god that could only be admired from afar, could only be worshipped, untainted by the world of mortals. Shuilan was as beautiful as a jade tree. The first impression he gave others was that he was gentle and elegant, like a modest gentleman. However, deep in his bones, he was sinister and vicious. His temperament was even more volatile. His aura was undoubtedly extremely powerful. Once it exploded, it would make people feel a chill down to their bones. As for the man in front of her, he was languid and flirtatious like a Persian cat walking on the piano keys. His every move was elegant and picturesque. He looked a little sloppy, like a dissolute wastrel. However, there was also a natural and noble aura on his body. His status was probably not low, and looking at his expression towards Han Shanyue, although he was respectful, it was not the kind of respect that a subordinate would have when meeting his superior. Instead, it was more like a friend, or even a close friend. Who would have thought that the high and mighty Han Shanyue would have friends by his side? Looking at the place where this person lived, it was obvious that he was also an otherworldly expert. Ning Shuma looked at the scenery of the island without batting an eyelid. The blue sky and white clouds were like a wash. In the distance, the sea waves were like waves. It was a picturesque painting. All kinds of exotic flowers and herbs could be seen everywhere on the island. Originally, the extremely rare herbs in the mountains were growing here. There was a faint fragrance of flowers in the air, refreshing the mind and making people feel refreshed. Further away, there were several pavilions built on the mountainside. The roof was made of glass, and the walls were made of tortoiseshell. Chapter 591. In the distance, there were several pavilions built on the mountainside. Glazed tiles were used as tiles, and tortoiseshell walls were used as walls. In the deep and shallow green forest, there was either a pavilion or half a body. Like a beauty covered with a veil, the most beautiful thing was this kind of hazy charm. How is my mountain residence? Rongyue Tianlan waved his fan and struck up a conversation with Ning Shuima. It's a utopia. The beauty of the scenery is picturesque. Ning Shuima gave him the most pertinent and highest evaluation. Rongyue Tianlan smiled and squinted his eyes. He waved his fan even more vigorously. This evaluation is pertinent. You are indeed my soulmate. My place is indeed the most beautiful place in the world. Unlike someone who usually has noble taste but can't appreciate the beautiful scenery here. He even said that it was gaudy and vulgar. When he said the last sentence, he glanced at Han Shanyue, who was walking in front. Obviously, this someone was referring to Dizwa, who was like a snowy mountain. Ning Shuima shook her head. If Brother Rongyue's place is called vulgar, then there is really no place in the world that isn't vulgar. Her words were, firstly, the truth. Secondly, she now had a favor to ask of him. It was not wrong to flatter him. Rongyue Tianlan obviously enjoyed her praise. He chatted with Ning Shuima for a while, intentionally or unintentionally trying to dig out some information from her mouth. However, Ning Shuima was also a cunning person. Her words were watertight. Rongyue Tianlan didn't dig out any gossip. Ning Shuima was usually very talkative, and Rongyue Tianlan wasn't a taciturn person. The two of them chatted and laughed at the back and gradually became familiar with each other. In the end, Ning Shuima started to call Rongyue Brother Rongyue. Rongyue Tianlan already knew Ning Shuima's age from the conversation. He was very surprised that she was only 13 years old. Of course, he was not used to her calling him brother at first, but he enjoyed it very much. In this world, there were too few people who dared to call him brother. He felt that it was very rare. Amused, he suddenly felt that he was still a young and inexperienced youth. Han Shanyue, who had been leading the way, suddenly slowed down and glanced at Rongyue Tianlan. Rongyue, how old are you? Rongyue Shinlin, He rubbed his nose. Before he could say anything, Han Shangyue added, "You are old enough to be her great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Are you not embarrassed to let her call you brother? Dizwa, you are old enough to be her ancestor. So how can you have the nerve to make her your concubine?" Rong Yuishenlin complained in his heart. Of course, he didn't dare to say it out loud. He coughed and said, I feel that I'm still a young man." Ning Shuima also tried to smooth things over for him. No matter how old brother Rongyu is, his appearance has always been that of an elegant young man. It's not inappropriate to call him brother Rongyu. As the saying goes, a head full of white is as good as new. As long as you get along, there's no need to care about age. Isn't there also the phrase, a friend regardless of age? This Rongyue Tianlan should be someone from the same generation as Han Shangyue. However, he had a free and easy personality. He made people feel that he was very easygoing and easy to make friends with. Han Shangyue, his face didn't look too good. He started to wonder if he looked too old. He seemed to be around 20 years old. So why did this girl ask him how old he was that day in the carriage? It was such a spoil sport. Time was like floating clouds to him, leaving no trace. Chapter 592. Initially, he had never considered how old he was, but ever since he met this girl, he suddenly became sensitive to the issue of age. He originally had a peerless appearance, and his facial features were perfect without a single flaw. It was just that his usual aura was too strong, and his temperament was too cold. Moreover, he was high and mighty, which made him seem big for no reason. This made it difficult for Ning Shuima to treat him as someone of the same age as her. Han Shangyue glanced at Ning Shuima and said faintly, "Sometimes, don't always be confused by other people's facade." As he spoke, he had already slowed down and walked side by side with Ning Shuima. The mountain road was narrow. Han Shangyue and Ning Shuima walked side by side, squeezing Rong Yuishenlin to the back. Of course, Kirin was even further behind. Rong Yuishenlin's eyes flashed with a meaningful look. He touched his nose and went to talk to Kirin. Kirin was an honest person. When he asked one question, this little guy would answer 8 questions. Rong Yuishenlin was happy that he had finally found a breakthrough in gossip. Han Shanyue's cold voice sounded, "Rong Yuishenlin, is this your way of being a master? Letting a guest lead the way for you?" Rong Yuishenlin was speechless. "Big brother, when did you treat yourself as a guest here? You're more like a master than me, okay? Now you're acting like a guest." Rong Yuishenlin sighed secretly. Today, he felt that he was being blamed for everything. It was not easy to be friends with Dizwa. He waved his fan and resigned himself to his fate as he led the way. Kirin was in a bad mood at the back. It had been completely ignored just now, and it had been walking at the back with grievances. It was not easy for someone to pay attention to it, but it did not expect that after a few words, it would be ordered to the front. It was left alone again. It was so miserable and lonely. Ning Shuima still felt sorry for it. She quickly noticed that it was listless, so she took a step back and waited for Kirin to come up. "Little Apple, are you still not feeling well?" That dizziness had not completely passed? Wow, Master finally noticed it. It seemed that if it was uncomfortable, its master would be more concerned about it. The little Qilin was blessed with good fortune. Its tail drooped even more, and even its ears drooped down. It used a nasal sound to say, still a little dizzy." It even staggered a bit. The little Qilin's face was bright blue. Even if it was uncomfortable, it wouldn't show its sickly pale face. Therefore, Ning Shuima simply touched its forehead and rubbed its ears. After all, she had raised Kirin for a while. Ning Shuima knew that when Kirin was really uncomfortable, its ears would heat up, and its forehead temperature would be lower than usual. Kirin felt very comfortable and warm from her touch. She couldn't help but touch her hand with the corner of her mouth again. The man and the beast unconsciously fell behind. If Ning Shuima returned to her original form, this scene would be extraordinarily heartwarming. Since Ning Shuima reunited with Kirin, she had not really talked to it. At this time, she was chatting with it casually. She suddenly thought of something and asked, "By the way, little apple, weren't you traveling with the Almighty and the others? Why haven't you arrived by the time they've reached the outskirts of Fenglan City?" Kieran felt wronged. Shui Ilan, that pervert, cut off the telepathy between you and me. He also changed your scent, so I couldn't smell you even if I wanted to. I was very anxious. It gave a brief account of what had happened in the brothel. Chapter 593. It briefly recounted what had happened in the brothel and continued, "After coming out of the brothel, I suddenly smelled your scent from somewhere else. I was overjoyed and wanted to chase after that scent, but Celestial Master Han said that it should be an illusion deliberately made by Shui Ilan, and that the direction should be wrong. Fenglan City has 3 gates that lead to the outside. To be safe, the 3 of us each went in one direction. I didn't expect that bird to go in the right direction, but I'm not slow either. As soon as I received Celestial Master Han's signal, I immediately rushed over." As they spoke, the group finally entered Rongyue Tianlan's courtyard. They entered a vase-like door and went around a natural mountain rock. The scenery in the courtyard was unobstructed. Ning Shuema's footsteps also slightly paused. Rongyue Tianlan's courtyard was elegant enough. On the left was a cluster of strange flowers, and on the right was a row of strange plants that looked like coral beans with red fruits. In the middle of the courtyard, there was a big tree. The big tree was about 70 to 80 feet tall, and its huge crown was like a canopy. It was unknown what kind of strange tree this tree was. The lines on the trunk were like twisting coiled dragons, and the dark brown bark was like dragon scales that cracked into pieces. The leaves of the big tree were heart-shaped, and the color was like a fire maple. It was bright red like a fire in full swing. When the breeze blew, a few leaves fell down and rolled in the wind. It was a beautiful sight. However, what made Ning Shuema stop was not this. Instead, it was because she saw another person here, a person she did not expect to see. Yunshi. Yunshi was sitting under the tree. The grass under the tree was like a carpet, and there was a straw futon on the grass. She sat cross-legged on the futon with her eyes slightly closed, as if she was meditating. The fiery red leaves spiraled down and danced around her. A few fell on her lapel, sticking to her snow-white dress and her ink-black hair, making her look like a flower spirit, a fairy of the leaves. She was astonishingly beautiful. When Ning Shuema saw this scene, she was also stunned. She couldn't help but hold her breath, afraid that if she breathed out too much, she would blow this beauty away. Han Shanyue also paused slightly and glanced at Rongyue Tianlan. Rongyue Shenlin chuckled. "It just so happens that Yunshi is also here. It's rare for the 3 of us to get together again. Let's have a toast." Yunshi, who was meditating, seemed to be alarmed by the crowd's voices. Her long eyelashes fluttered like butterfly wings before she finally opened her eyes. Seeing Han Shanyue and the others, her eyes lit up. She stood up and walked over quickly. "I didn't expect to meet you here." Her watery eyes fell on Ning Shuema again. She said in a gentle tone, "Miss, you look much better." Ning Shuema raised her hand to touch her wrinkled face. She really couldn't imagine how good her complexion could be. "Miss Yunshi's complexion looks much better. Congratulations, congratulations." She smiled amiably as she said, "Miss Yunshi's complexion looks much better." The 2 girls looked at each other and smiled. The atmosphere was harmonious. Yunshi's complexion was indeed much better. Now, her skin was as fair and translucent as if it was carved out of jade. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, and under her watery eyes, she was even more beautiful. She was much prettier than when Ning Shuema had first met her. However, this coincidental encounter was too deliberate. She must have guessed that Han Shanyue would bring Ning Shuema to find Rongyue Tianlan, so she came here in advance to wait. Chapter 594. Furthermore, it was obvious that she had put in a lot of effort into her makeup. Whether it was her fluttering, immortal-like dress or the headdress on her head, Everything was exquisite. There were also a few jade bells hanging from her waist. They jingled as she walked, making her look lively and playful in the midst of her elegance. Intentionally or unintentionally, she stood beside Han Shangyue and said with a smile, "With your help, Yunqi's body has finally stabilized. However, her qi and blood are still occasionally unstable, so Yunqi came to ask Brother Tianlan for a few fruits to eat. I didn't expect to meet you again here. This is really fate. The three of us haven't met for more than 10 days. This time, the two of you have to play a few rounds. How about Yunqi make a crystal fruit as a prize?" Rangi Wishenlin clapped and laughed. "That sounds good. Yunqi's crystal fruit is the best. Brother Shangyue, we're in for a treat this time. I want to win a few rounds." Ning Shuima stood at the side and watched this scene lazily. The three of them were obviously good friends, and this was how friends met. It was just that she was excluded right now. The three of them stood not far away and formed a group. Ning Shuima stood at the side and acted as a backdrop. She was just a concubine who could be used as a shield for Han Shangyue, and the two of them had intentionally excluded her. Rangi Yuishenlin should be happy for Yunqi to pursue Han Shangyue, right? He was happy to see it happen. Yunqi was his friend, so it was understandable that he was biased towards his friend. However, he didn't know that there was nothing between her and Han Shangyue. Sigh. It seemed that it wasn't easy to be a shield. If she offended these two gods again, her life in this world would be even more difficult. Damn it, she hadn't offended anyone since she came to this world, but she had attracted a lot of trouble that she couldn't get rid of. At this moment, Ning Shuima felt a little sad. "What are you waiting for? Come here." Ning Shuima rarely felt sorry for herself. She was in a daze when she heard Han Shanyue's voice. She looked up in surprise and saw Han Shanyue looking at her expressionlessly. Why would an outsider like her attend a gathering between the three of them? Ning Shuima didn't react for a moment. She stared at him blankly. Han Shanyue was also looking at her with an unreadable gaze. Ning Shuima suddenly came to a realization. That's right, I promised to be his shield. Isn't this the right time? She immediately strode over. Just as she reached Han Shanyue's side, he held her hand. Han Shanyue's voice was calm as he said, "Tianlan, I'm here to seek medical treatment, not to catch up." Ning Shuima also perked up and leaned her head on his shoulder, showing a very intimate look. "Husband, your friend should be very reliable, right?" Han Shanyue was satisfied with her taking the initiative to approach him. He glanced at Rongyue Tianlan, who seemed to have been struck by lightning, and said, "He has always been reliable in this aspect. If he is not reliable this time, I have ways to make him unreliable for the rest of his life." This threat was unique. Rongyue Tianlan's heart trembled. She touched her nose and smiled. Don't worry. I can naturally return you to your youthful beauty and restore you to your original state." This sentence undoubtedly gave Ning Shuima a reassurance. She smiled again. "Thank you, Brother Rongyue." Rongyue Tianlan said, No need. You are Brother Shanyue's wife. In the future, you will be my sister-in-law." Chapter 595. When he saw Yunqi's pale face, he shut his mouth and laughed. Then, he tapped his forehead with his fan. This sandwich biscuit was really hard to make. Love affairs were not something an outsider like him could interfere with, nor could he force it. It was better for him not to interfere. Therefore, Rongyue Tianlan took a step back and turned a blind eye to Yunqi's pleading gaze. The hall was filled with dazzling jewels, from the moon pearls on the ceiling to the small ornament on the table in the middle of the hall. Everything was exquisite and perfect. The layout of the entire house was gorgeous with a hint of quaint elegance. It was the style that Ning Shuima liked. Ning Shuima casually browsed around the hall while Yunqi sat quietly and drank tea. After entering the hall, Rongyue Tianlan had invited Han Shanyue into a secret room to have a private talk. Only the two love rivals were left in the hall. A servant came forward to serve them fragrant tea. The tea was good, and the refreshments were also unprecedentedly exquisite. Ning Shuima did not have much interest in tasting them. Rongyue Tianlan's expression had been solemn just now, as if there was something that made things difficult for him. Therefore, he had called Han Shanyue in to discuss it. It was obvious that this matter had something to do with her disguise. She did not know how to undo it. Ning Shuima was a little uncertain. Besides, she and Yunqi had nothing to talk about. The atmosphere between them was slightly awkward. Therefore, she simply stood up and browsed around the hall. When she turned her head, she saw an exquisite chessboard by the window. There were black and white pieces crisscrossing on it. She was quite proficient in chess, so she walked over to take a look at the game. Just as she was analyzing the black and white pieces, a voice came from behind her. "Miss Ning, you also know how to play chess. Why don't we play a game?" Ning Shuima was a little bored, so she did not stand on ceremony.
Sure.
Then, she sat down. Yunqi smiled slightly and sat on the other side. She looked at the game and then at Ning Shuima. Tianlan and I played this game just now. He played the white piece and I played the black piece. Now that you're sitting on the white piece, do you want to replace him? Ning Shuima's lips curled up, and she smiled back at her. That's good, but this way I will have a big advantage. The white pieces had the upper hand in the current chess game, but the black pieces had yet to show any signs of weakness. People who didn't know much about chess wouldn't be able to tell, and Ning Shuima's words clearly indicated that she had already seen through it, and she had only stood in front of the chessboard for less than a minute. Yunqi pursed her lips and calmly sized up Ning Shuima. Please. The two of them began to play chess. Yunqi was quite talented in chess, and she had watched two chess experts for many years. Naturally, she was very accomplished in the game. Although her Go skills were not as good as her two friends, she rarely met opponents outside. She could be considered a Go expert. Therefore, although she could see that Ning Shuima was good at chess, she didn't take it to heart. She also wanted to take down Ning Shuima's prestige in the chess game, so she didn't show any mercy. She found that Ning Shuima didn't play according to common sense. When she started to play the first few pieces, she simply hammered here and there without any order. At first, Yunqi sneered at her in her heart. However, after a while, she was no longer happy in her heart. Ning Shuima's moves were strange. She often inadvertently took a few pieces from her and disrupted her deployment. Chapter 596. Moreover, Ning Shuima played very quickly. She seemed to be playing casually without thinking. In order not to lose face in front of her, Yunqi played as quickly as she did. As a result, after 10 minutes, Yunqi's palms were sweating as she held the chess pieces. Her black pieces were already showing signs of defeat. After a few more moves, her black pieces were finally unable to turn the tables and were completely defeated. Ning Shuima picked up the teacup next to her and took a sip. She smiled slightly and said, "Thank you for letting me win." Yunqi pursed her lips and clenched her fists in her sleeves. She forced a smile and said, "Miss Ning, you're good at chess. Although Brother Tianlan took most of the credit for this game, it was not easy for you to stay undefeated until the end." Ning Shuima put down the teacup and smiled leisurely. "That's why I said that I had a big advantage in this game." Yunqi packed up the black and white chess pieces. "Shall we play another game?" Ning Shuima's eyes flashed slightly. "Okay, but it's boring to play chess like this. Why don't we make a bet?" "What bet?" Yunqi raised her eyebrows and asked. "It's very simple. Let's play a best-of-5 game. If I win, you can stop coveting Mr. Han Shanyue." Ning Shuima's words were shocking and directly hit Yunqi's weak spot. Yunqi's expression changed, and she subconsciously denied it. "What nonsense are you talking about? I'm not." Ning Shuima glanced at her, her eyes faintly sharp. "You don't even have the courage to admit it? How can you catch up with him like this? If you like him, just admit it. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not wrong to like someone." Yunqi's pretty face turned green and white. She was a little embarrassed that Ning Shuima had exposed her. Ning Shuima's words touched her heart and touched her. Although Ning Shuima's words were bold, they seemed to be very reasonable. She gritted her teeth and said, "What if you lose?" Ning Shuima weighed the chess piece in her hand and answered casually, "It's simple. I'll give him to you and fulfill your wish." Yunqi was stunned for a moment before she burst into laughter. "I don't want to be his concubine." She felt that her words were enough to deal a blow to Ning Shuima, so she leisurely added a few more words. "Miss Ning, it's not that my words are unpleasant, but a concubine is just a little better than a servant girl. Her status is similar to that of a servant girl in a common household. Men wouldn't take her seriously, and I was originally his close friend. We've known each other for many years. I'm not something a concubine that can be discarded at any time can compare to." These words were too harsh. Yunqi thought that Ning Shuima would be embarrassed to death after hearing these words. She hadn't expected that Ning Shuima would just smile and say, "Yes, the status of a concubine is indeed not high. In that case, why is Miss Yunqi so hostile towards me?" Yunqi was stunned and subconsciously denied it. When have I been hostile towards you?" Ning Shuima smiled calmly and stared at her again. "You don't dare to admit it?" Did she think that her hostility wasn't obvious enough? Yunqi was choked by her words and couldn't say anything. She never knew that Ning Shuima could be so sharp and direct with her words. She almost couldn't hide her little thoughts. She secretly took a breath and steadied her mind. She forced a smile and said, "Well, I do feel a little uncomfortable when I see you, but it's not considered hostility. After all, hostility depends on the opponent. Only a strong opponent can arouse hostility." Chapter 597. Ning Shuima smiled and said, "Do you think I'm not worthy of your hostility?" Yunqi snorted and said, "You're just his concubine." She looked at Ning Shuima's face and said, "Miss Ning, do you think that he treats you well, so you're feeling smug? In fact, he treats you like a plaything. He has a very bad habit that you probably don't know about. He's lived for a long time, and life is boring, so he often cultivates a few small interests to pass the time. For example, he raised rare animals for a period of time. He raised foxes, leopards, and so on. He even raised Cheongqi. He did his best to raise them and treated them very well. He made them think that they belonged to him and that he would spoil them for the rest of their lives." She picked up the teacup beside her and took a sip before looking at Ning Shuima's expression. Ning Shuima's face was full of wrinkles, so she couldn't tell whether she was in a good mood or not. Yunqi smiled faintly before she continued. However, he was no longer interested, so he put these precious beasts aside. He gave them away and set them free. My snow lion originally belonged to him, but he later gave it to me as a mount. Tianlan Swanee was also a gift from him. After these rare animals were sent away, they realized that they were just passers-by in his life. After a few years, he didn't even remember their names. Ning Shuima turned the teacup in her hand and seemed to be very interested. When she heard Yunqi pause, she said, "Continue." Yunqi was stunned and looked at Ning Shuima again. Did this little girl really not care, or was she very calm? She couldn't help but want to poke at Ning Shuima. These rare beasts were once his playthings. Later on, although they were given away, they still know a few things about him. For example, his real name and his likes and dislikes. This shows that he still cares about them a little. Of course, he didn't even bother to tell them his name. Ning Shuima listened without showing any expression, but she smiled bitterly in her heart. Sure enough, she couldn't even compare to those rare animals in his heart. She took a deep breath. Fortunately, it was just a deal between them. She was just his shield concubine, so he didn't have to explain so much to her. And she didn't have to care so much. Although she had already thought this through, she still felt a little uncomfortable in her heart. She was just glad that she hadn't fallen in love with him yet. Fortunately, it was just a deal between them. Since she was a good shield, then she would be a good shield. Her first priority now was to help him destroy this peach blossom. She tapped her finger on the chessboard. "What you said is indeed very reasonable. Since that's the case, isn't it better for you to be his confidant? Why must you have a crush on him and want to marry him? Aren't you afraid that you'll end up like those rare animals?" Yunqi was stunned. I want to be his wife. I want to be by his side for the rest of his life. I want to be with him. I want to be, I have. Generation after generation? Forever? This was nothing more than a person's beautiful wish. How could there be any life after life in this world? Forever is even more nonsense. Ning Xuema chuckled. There's a saying in our world called the 7-year itch. Chapter 598. Ning Xuema chuckled. In my world, we have a saying called the 7-year itch. There's also a saying that marriage is the grave of love. It means that no matter how much love two people have, once they live together for a long time, they will eventually get tired of each other. Humans have such a short lifespan. What's more, immortals like you who have limitless lifespans. You said it yourself. Great God Han has the habit of liking the new and hating the old. Even if you marry him as his wife, he might get tired of you after a few years. Once you separate, it will be a resentful couple. At that time, you won't even be friends anymore. These words were too realistic and sharp. Yunshi, who had lived for thousands of years and was still a little white flower, was stunned. After a while, she angrily said, "He won't. He will love me very, very much. We can be considered childhood sweethearts. You can't be envious of our relationship." Ning Xuema smiled and shook her head. "I don't envy you." What was there to envy about a girl who had fallen in love with someone else? She only felt that she was pitiful and tragic. Yunshi didn't understand her unspoken words and sneered. "You can't be envious even if you want to. You are just a little concubine of his. Actually, I'm quite curious. Since you have been by his side for thousands of years, why can't you make him fall in love with you? Aren't you afraid of lowering your status and attacking the concubine you despise the most? Could it be that you are envious of the position of concubine? Are you just too embarrassed to say it?" Ning Xuema looked at her with a smile. Her words pierced Yunshi's heart. Yunshi had originally wanted to attack Ning Xuema, but she hadn't expected that after saying so much, she hadn't attacked Ning Xuema. Instead, she had attacked Ning Xuema. Her face was snow-white, and she clenched her fists. You are talking nonsense. I don't envy you. I just don't like you. You don't deserve to stay by his side, not even as a concubine." She was so embarrassed that she finally said the words that had been buried in her heart. "Very good." Ning Xuema pointed at the chessboard. "Then let's bet on these few games. I also don't like you, so why don't we be straightforward? If I lose, I quit. I don't want to be a concubine anymore. If you've lost, you should quit. Don't try to appear in front of him again. To be honest, the reason you came up with is pretty lame. It sounds so fake to me." When it came to provoking people, Ning Xuema was definitely an expert. After all, Yunshi had lived a simple life. How could she beat Ning Xuema, who could battle a group of scholars with words? Ning Xuema's words stung her so much that she flew into a rage out of humiliation. Blood rushed to her head and she made up her mind. "I'll bet. This consort will make you accept your defeat wholeheartedly." Ning Xuema smiled. "All right. How satisfying. This was more like an immortal." "Oh right. You won't go back on your word if you lose, right?" Yunchi was furious. "Of course not. I am a woman of my word." "Then you have to make an oath first." Ning Xuema pressed on. Yunchi was stunned. She didn't want to make an oath, but since she was forced to this point, it wouldn't make sense for her to not make an oath. She didn't believe that she would lose to Ning Xuema. She didn't believe that she, a dignified palace master, couldn't lose to an ordinary woman. She finally made an oath. "If this consort loses, I will never appear in front of Han Shanyue again." The faint sound of thunder came from afar, proving that the oath had been made. Since she had made an oath, she naturally wanted Ning Xuema to make an oath as well. Ning Xuema was more straightforward when she made an oath. Yunchi also had her own plans in mind. Chapter 599. If Ning Xuema won this time, she would be able to help Han Shangyue get rid of one of his admirers. If she lost, she would be able to officially annul her engagement with Han Shangyue and stop being his concubine. Regardless of whether she won or lost, it would be beneficial to her. Therefore, Ning Xuema felt no pressure playing chess this time. The two of them started the game. Ning Xuema played casually. Yunqi, on the other hand, would think for a long time before she made a move. She had to win. However, she had obviously underestimated Ning Xuema's chess skills. Ning Xuema had once defeated a world champion in the modern era. Furthermore, her chess style was ever-changing, so others simply couldn't grasp her pattern. Of course, Yunqi couldn't grasp it either. In the first game, Ning Xuema took the route of capturing the leader first. Her chess style was grand and sweeping, and Yunqi was defeated. Yunqi was sweating profusely. She gathered her energy and played the second game with Ning Xuema. She had already thought of a way to deal with Ning Xuema's chess style. Step by step, she would defend like Sima Yi. However, she hadn't expected that Ning Xuema's chess style would change again. She began to nibble away at Yunqi's weakness step by step. She didn't attack head-on. Instead, she focused on attacking Yunqi's weakness and then surrounded her in the middle. After an hour, Yunqi showed signs of defeat again. Her face was pale, and beads of sweat rolled down her forehead. She couldn't afford to lose this game. She had to win. She was so focused on the game in front of her that she didn't even notice when Han Shangyue, Rongyue, and Tianlan came out. Yunqi was holding a piece in her hand and thinking hard when a voice sounded behind her. "Play here." A slender, jade-like finger pointed to a position. The voice was as cold as ever, but Yunqi's heart was filled with joy and warmth. Without saying anything, she immediately placed the piece there. Ning Xuema looked up at Han Shangyue, who was standing beside Yunqi, and said with a faint smile, "Great master, don't speak while watching chess. What you are doing is against the rules of chess." Han Shanyue's gaze landed on Ning Xuema. Then, he looked at the chessboard in front of him. His eyes were filled with surprise. Clearly, he had not expected Ning Xuema to be so good at Go. This was beyond his expectations. He had always been a chess fanatic, and it was very difficult for him to meet an opponent. Now that he had seen this chess game, his hands were itching. Yunqi's side was clearly losing, so he could easily salvage the situation. He tapped the chessboard with his finger. "Yunqi, get up." Yunqi, who was secretly delighted, stood up gracefully. "All right, please help me win this round, sir." She then gave up her seat. Han Shanyue switched to another chair and sat opposite Ning Xuema. Ning Xuema looked at him. "Guru, are you sure you want to kill this game for her?" Han Shanyue gave a light hum. His fingers had already picked up a chess piece. "The chessboard is like a battlefield. I will not give way to you." Ning Xuema also straightened up, smiled, and said straightforwardly, "Okay? Just don't regret it, Guru." Han Shanyue did not continue the conversation. He did not know what regret was in this lifetime. The two of them sat in front of the chessboard and started to fight. When Ning Xuema was playing chess with Yunqi, she was just playing casually because Yunqi's chess skills were still too low for her. She was just playing chess with her to kill time and help Han Shanyue get rid of the peach blossoms. Therefore, Ning Xuema did not give her all. However, now that Han Shanyue had taken over, she immediately felt that her opponent's chess skills were strong. Although winning or losing did not matter to her, her competitive nature did not allow her to easily lose to him. Chapter 600. Ning Xuema immediately perked up and began to fight seriously with Han Shanyue. The two of them went back and forth, and it was an eye-opener for the two spectators. Yunqi's face turned pale after watching for a while. She had finally witnessed Ning Xuema's chess skills. Ning Xuema's chess skills were much better than she had imagined. If she had continued to play with her, she would have lost all 3 games without a doubt. There was no suspense at all. She hadn't expected this girl to have such an ability. She was clearly just a teenage girl. How could her chess skills be better than hers, who had been immersed in the game for thousands of years? Unfair. It was too unfair. Rongyue Tianlan was also a chess fan. At first, he didn't take Ning Xuema seriously, But after watching for a while, he had a whole new level of respect for this little girl. This little girl's chess skills were unprecedentedly high. An expert. Her moves were simply too cool. Every move was within reason, but also beyond his expectations. She gave him a surprise every few moves. When Ning Xuema and Yunqi were playing, it was still an ordinary game. However, after the two of them fought for half an hour, the situation on the chessboard had completely changed. The two of them each made strange moves, and the game was full of ups and downs. It was like two strong opponents on a battlefield filled with smoke. Although flesh and blood were flying everywhere, it still made people's blood boil. Rongyue Tianlan was delighted to see this. He couldn't wait to chase Han Shangyue away so that he could have some fun too. He watched from the side and even forgot to wave his fan. His eyes were fixed on the chessboard as he pondered the game. Playing chess really didn't care about age. Talent was extremely important. This was also why sometimes a teenager could kill everyone, defeat national chess players, and create miracles. The world of chess had no lack of miracles. There were often dark horses that jumped out to amaze people. Ning Xuema was no doubt such a dark horse. She was good at calculation and setting up traps for others. Chess was a perfect match for her. In this game, sometimes the white pieces had the upper hand, and sometimes the black pieces had the upper hand. The ups and downs were dazzling. In the beginning, Han Shangyue did not take Ning Xuema seriously. But after a quarter of an hour, after suffering 2 or 3 hidden losses from her, he finally began to take her seriously. The two of them played this game of chess for nearly 2 hours before the outcome was finally revealed. Han Shangyue won by a narrow margin. Yunqi finally felt at ease. She smiled and said, "Thank you, sir, for helping me win this game of chess." Han Shanyue's chess addiction had been completely aroused by Ning Xuema. He didn't care about what Yunqi had said. He just looked at Ning Xuema. His eyes seemed to sparkle as he tapped the chessboard with his finger. 2 more games. Ning Xuema looked at the chessboard and then at him. "Are you still playing for her?" Han Shanyue did not care about this at all. What was the difference between him playing for Yunqi and playing for himself? Wasn't it all because of him? He had always been a man of few words. So, he only made a sound of agreement and urged her to continue. Ning Xuema's eyes flickered slightly. She raised her hand and touched the slightly prominent cinnabar mole on her forehead. Perhaps she could cancel this heavenly marriage today. She had been tricked into agreeing to this heavenly marriage. Now, she could use the same method to cancel it with him. It could be considered as getting back at him, however. If she canceled this heavenly marriage, she would have no protection. Would Han Shanyue still be willing to protect her? This was really an unknown factor. Ning Xuema was slightly lost in thought. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.